Arte opened his eyes and immediately squinted. The sun was hanging right above him, white and menacing. He had never seen a sun like this before. It didn't warm him, it burned him. He turned his head and saw two pairs of feet, bare and dirty. One pair was small, a child's. The other pair was larger, with cracked heels and bulging veins. He looked up. Two people were standing over him. A boy of about 12 with a split lip, and a woman in a coarse linen shawl, her face as parched as the earth on which he lay. Both were looking at him. Their eyes reflected the same thing, fear and eager curiosity, as if they'd found a wounded animal in the desert and couldn't decide whether to finish it off or walk away. Arte sat up. The world swayed and swam before his eyes. He looked at his hands. Scrapes. Sand had burrowed into his scraped skin. The blood had already crusted over into brown scabs. He looked further. Clay huts, a dozen or so, low and crooked. Cracked walls. Roofs made of bundles of reeds. Skinny goats wandered among the huts. In the distance, a donkey brayed, long yang and heart-wrenching, as if complaining to someone about everything at once. Arte shifted his gaze to the right and saw a ditch, a narrow, murky ditch 30 paces long. A goat was drinking from it. Standing next to the goat was a naked child of about 3, scooping water with his hands. Arte looked at the ditch, and the first thought formed slowly and calmly inside his head. The slope is wrong. The water's stagnant. By evening, it'll start to bloom. In a week, someone will come down with an intestinal infection. In 2 weeks, someone will die. Most likely the child. The second thought was simpler. Where am I? The woman held out a clay bowl to him. There was water in the bowl, murky with a greenish tinge. Arte looked at the bowl, then at the ditch, then at the woman. She was waiting. Something else had joined the fear in her eyes. Perhaps pity. Arte gently pushed her hand away, not roughly, carefully, the way you pull a child's hand away when it's reaching toward a fire. The woman frowned. The boy said something quickly and in a guttural voice. Arte didn't understand a single word, not one. The language was unfamiliar. Not Arabic, not Farsi, not Turkic. Nothing he'd heard during his 8 years working in Kazakhstan and Siberia. He gestured. Dig. Here. Deeper. He crossed his arms. The boy stared at him with his mouth agape. Then he laughed, a clear, cheerful laugh.
The kind children laugh when an adult does something ridiculous. Arte stood up. His legs were unsteady, his knees were shaking, his head was buzzing, but he stood up and walked over to the ditch. For the first 3 days he ate almost nothing. A woman in a headscarf brought him flatbreads made of something grey and hard. He ate them one small piece at a time. His stomach churned. The only water was that, murky, from the ditch. Arte filtered it through a piece of cloth he'd torn from his own shirt. Then he let it settle in a bowl. Then he drank the top layer. The boy watched his every move. He didn't stray a step away. Arte showed him. Here's the water. It's dirty. Here's the cloth. The water's cleaner through the cloth. The boy nodded. He didn't understand why, but he remembered. Arte silently named him Kibi. Later it turned out that the boy's real name was indeed Kibi. The coincidence was so precise that for a second Arte thought maybe it wasn't a coincidence after all. But he didn't dwell on it. He had other things on his mind. On the 3rd day, the child died. A girl was 3 years old, the daughter of that very woman in the headscarf. Arte found out about it at dawn.
He woke up to a sound. It wasn't a scream, it was a howl, quiet and steady, like the wind howling through an empty pipe. The woman was sitting on the ground in front of her hut, rocking back and forth. A body lay on her lap, small and motionless. People stood around her, in silence. No one was crying. They were used to it. Arte could tell by their faces. They were used to children dying. It was as common as the sunrise and the braying of a donkey. An old man with a shaved head and a gaunt face, presumably the village elder, spoke a long, solemn speech. Kibi translated as best he could. The ditch demon had taken her. Arte listened. He nodded. Then he walked to the edge of the ditch. He picked up a stick. He crouched down and began drawing in the sand. 2 lines. The first from the outhouse behind the farthest hut, the second from the drinking ditch. He drew them slowly and carefully. The lines crossed. Arte poked the point where they met with his stick. Then he looked at the elder, and at his fingers. Slowly. Very slowly. He pointed. Mud comes from here. Water comes from here. Mud gets into the water. Water gets into the child. The child dies. Not a demon. Mud. The elder looked at the diagram, then at Arte, then back at the diagram. His face darkened.
He stepped toward Arte and raised his hand.
Arte didn't flinch. He just watched. The elder stopped his hand. Then he turned and walked to the ditch. He stood at the edge. He looked upstream toward the cesspit behind the huts. He stared for a long time. Arte saw his face change. The anger faded. It was replaced by understanding. A heavy and terrifying realization. The realization that all these years he had been drinking poison and feeding it to his children. By evening, the whole village was digging. Arte didn't give orders. He showed them. Dig right here, this deep, in this direction. He determined the slope by eye and with a stick. In his past life, he'd have a laser level. Here, he had a stick and a rope with a stone tied to the end. That was enough. Physics hadn't changed in centuries. Water flows downhill. Mud is heavier than clean water and settles. If you space the springs 50 paces apart and give the water channel a slope of 1/1000th, the water will flow. Flowing water is alive. Stagnant water is dead. Arte knew this as surely as he knew his own name. The problem was that people didn't believe in the slope. They believed in demons. He didn't argue. He dug alongside them, in silence. There were no shovels, just wooden sticks with stones tied to the ends. Stone Age hoes. Arte scraped his hands raw on the first day. On the second, he wrapped rags around his palms. On the third, his skin began to toughen. On the fourth, the boy Kibi brought him a pair of homemade gloves made from goatskin. Arte looked at Kibi and smiled for the first time in 4 days. They dug the ditch for 9 days. The new diversion channel led the dirty water away from the drinking water channel. Arte built a simple settling tank, a pit as deep as a man's height, lined with stones. Water flowed in on one side. The sediment settled at the bottom. Clean water flowed out on the other side through a narrow chute at chest height. A design that is 4,000 years old. One that worked in Mohenjo-Daro, and in Roman aqueducts, and in the villages of Siberia where Arte built treatment plants. Here it worked exactly the same way, because physics knows no boundaries between eras. 2 weeks after the drainage system began operating, not a single person in the village fell ill with an intestinal disease. 3 weeks later, a woman in a headscarf brought Arte a bowl of water. Another one, from the new channel. Crystal clear. Arte looked at the water, then at the woman.
She wasn't smiling.
She looked at him the way one looks at a person to whom one owes something that can never be repaid. Arte drank the water. It was warm and clean. No aftertaste, no cloudiness, just water. He nodded. The woman nodded in response. Then she left. Kibi said her name was Nanaya, that her husband had died 2 years ago, that the girl was her youngest daughter, her last. Arte listened and said nothing. Then he asked, in the broken local language he'd picked up over the past few weeks, how many more children were in the village. Kibi held up his fingers. 23. Arte nodded. 23. He memorized that number. It became the first entry in his mind, the first line of the record he would keep for years to come. The language came slowly, but wasn't as difficult as he'd feared. The structure was simple. Subject, verb, object. No cases, no complex tenses. The words were short and concrete. Water, stone, bread, fire, child, death. Arte repeated after Kibi 100 times a day. The boy turned out to be a natural teacher, patient and meticulous. If Arte pronounced a word incorrectly, Kibi would repeat it over and over until he got it right. He didn't laugh. He didn't get annoyed. He just repeated it. Arte realized that Kibi wasn't just a smart boy. Kibi was hungry. Hungry for knowledge, for everything new, for any word and any thought that could be grasped and remembered. In another world, this boy would have gone to college. Here he herded goats and ate every other day. By the end of the first month, Arte could speak well enough to explain simple things. Water is dirty because there are tiny. You can't see them with your eyes, but they're there. Fire kills them. Boiled water is safe. You have to wash your hands after using the outhouse, every single time. People listened. Some nodded. Some tapped their fingers against their temples and walked away. The elder listened more attentively than anyone else. He didn't believe in tiny stars, but he saw the results. Not a single sick person in a month. Not a single dead child. For a village where 7 little ones had been buried over the past year, it was a miracle. Not a divine one, a dirty one, dug out by hand from the clay, but a miracle nonetheless. The healer Iltu arrived on the 30th day. Old, gaunt, with eyes like 2 black stones. She stood before Arte and said that he was stealing her power, that the demons obeyed him because he himself was a demon.
That if he didn't leave the village, she would curse him and his entire lineage. Arte listened.
Kibi whispered the translation. When she finished, Arte was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Willow bark." She knew about willow bark. Iltu fell silent. Of course she knew. Willow bark reduced fever. It was one of her secrets. One piece of knowledge she had guarded and never shared with anyone because that was the source of her power. Arte said, "Willow bark works. It's not the demons, it's the bark. It contains a substance that fights the fever. If you make a stronger decoction and give 3 sips every 4 hours, the fever will subside faster." Iltu looked at him for a long time. Then she turned and left. 3 days later, she returned with a bundle of willow bark, and she asked, "How much water for how much bark?" Arte told her. She remembered. She never called him a demon again. She didn't become his ally, but she stopped being his enemy. That was enough for a start. The people from Nar Ilu didn't leave. 3 men stayed the night at the edge of the village. The woman with the child, whose child Arte had tended to during the night, sat by his hut and refused to move until the stranger went with them. Arte didn't go. He explained through Kibi, "I can't leave. My work here isn't finished, but I can tell you what to do." The men exchanged glances. They weren't used to anyone handing out knowledge just like that. Knowledge was a valuable commodity. Knowledge belonged to whoever possessed it. Sharing knowledge was just as strange as sharing a wife or livestock. Arte understood this, but he had no choice. He was alone. There were many villages. The only way to save more people was to teach them themselves. He sat down with the men and drew in the sand, the lines of ditches, the distance between the outhouse and the drinking water, the direction of the slope, how to build a settling tank, how to boil water. The men listened. One of them, an elderly and silent man, drew along with him, tracing the lines. Arte pointed at him and said, "Kibi, he understands. Let him be the leader." Kibi translated. The older man looked at Arte with a long gaze. Then he nodded. They left on the third day. Arte returned to work. There was so much work that he fell asleep instantly every evening, as if someone had turned off the light inside his head. The ditch with the new diversion was working, but the system was fragile. One heavy rain and the riverbed would wash it away. They needed walls, stone or fired clay. There was almost no stone nearby.
Fine gravel on the riverbank, large boulders half a day's journey to the north. Hauling them without a cart or a road was pointless. That left clay. Arte crouched on the bank of the ditch and picked up a lump in his hands. He needed it. Rich, plastic, mixed with fine sand, good clay. He molded it into a cube the size of his fist. He set it out in the sun. A day later, the cube had dried and cracked. Arte picked it up and squeezed it. The cube crumbled. Unfired brick. The ordinary unfired brick they used to build everything here. Walls, floors, fences. It would crack in a single summer. It would get soggy in a single rainy season. It would crumble if you hit it with a stick. For 4,000 years, people would build with this, and then they'd discover one simple thing: fire. Arte found a spot for the furnace in the third month, a gentle slope on the edge of the village, far enough from the huts so the smoke wouldn't bother anyone, close enough to haul the bricks. He started small. He dug a pit as tall as a man. He lined the walls with whatever stones he could find. He made a chimney out of a clay pipe he'd fashioned by hand. The pipe turned out crooked and ugly, but the draft worked. Arte loaded the pit with raw bricks, 18 of them. He lined them with brushwood and dry manure. He lit it. Kibi stood nearby, watching with the expression of someone observing a madman. The whole village was watching. The fire burned for 2 days. Arte kept the fire going, didn't sleep, monitored the draft and added fuel. On the third day, he raked through the ashes. He pulled out the first brick. It was reddish. It rang hollow. He tapped it with a stone. The brick didn't crumble. It didn't crack. It rang. Arte held it out to the elder. The elder took it. He turned it over in his hands. He tried to break it with his bare hands. He couldn't. He struck it against a stone. The brick remained intact. The elder looked at Arte. There was something new in his eyes. Not fear, not curiosity. Respect. Heavy and slow, like the clay from which the brick was made. The first kiln produced 18 bricks in 3 days. That was a pitifully small amount. Hundreds were needed to reinforce the ditch walls, thousands to build a decent house. Arte needed a bigger kiln. And people. He couldn't build it alone. He didn't have enough hands. He didn't have enough strength. He'd get so tired that by evening he couldn't even lift a mug of water. His body was ordinary. A 34-year-old man of average height and build. Not a laborer, not an athlete. An engineer who had spent 8 years alternating between working in the field and sitting at a computer. There was no computer here. Here there was a shovel made of a stick and a stone.
and the sun, which made the skin on his shoulders peel off in flakes. Help came from where he expected. Pabil, a village blacksmith and coppersmith, broad-shouldered, taciturn, with hands like a blacksmith's. He came to the kiln on the 4th day after the first firing. He stood and watched. Arte paid him no mind. He worked, kneading clay, shaping bricks. Pabil watched for an hour. Then he walked over and silently took a lump of clay from Arte's hands. He kneaded it, molded a brick, placed it in a row with the rest. He looked at Arte. Arte nodded. Pabil stayed. He said almost nothing, but he worked for 3 men, and he understood fire. He'd worked with copper ore his whole life. He'd smelted copper in a small crucible. He knew the temperature. He knew the draft. He knew how a flame behaved in an enclosed space. In a week, the 2 of them rebuilt the furnace. They made it twice as big. They added a second chimney. The load increased to 70 bricks per firing, then to 100. Arte showed Pabil how to make a grate from clay rods so that air would flow evenly from below. Pabil understood right away. The next day, he came with 2 apprentices, young guys about 15 years old. They were afraid of Arte, but Pabil muttered something brief to them and they got to work. By the end of the 3rd month, the village had a stockpile of 400 bricks. Arte began reinforcing the ditch walls. The bricks were laid in clay mortar. The walls rose, straight, sturdy. Water flowed between them like through a gutter. It no longer eroded the banks. It didn't silt up. It didn't bloom. The villagers came to watch. They touched the walls with their hands. They tapped on them. They shook their heads. One woman asked through Kibi, "Could a house be built from bricks like these?" Arte said yes. "Yes," she asked. "Her house?" Arte looked at her hut. Clay walls with cracks as wide as a finger. A thatched roof through which the sky was visible. She and her 4 children lived in that house. Arte said, "Yes, her house, but not now. First the ditches, then a granary, then the houses." The woman nodded. She wasn't offended. She was used to waiting. Everyone here was used to waiting.
The rumor about the bricks spread faster than the rumor about the water. Water was an invisible miracle. People drank it and didn't get sick, but they didn't understand why. They saw the ditch and the settling tank, but the connection between death and disease remained an abstraction to most. Demons were easier to understand. A brick was different. You could hold a brick in your hands, tap it, throw it. It didn't break. It was a miracle you could touch. 5 men came from the village of Kushar Bel, a 2-hour journey to the north, and asked to be shown how to make such bricks. Arte showed them. No secrets, no conditions. Clay, mold, fire, temperature, time. That's all. The 5 men left and returned a month later. They hadn't succeeded. The kiln had fallen apart. The bricks had come out crumbly and misshapen. Arte sighed. He stood up and walked with them to Kushar Bel. 2 days. He built a kiln for them. He showed them again, right there, with his own hands, every step. They understood. On the way back, he thought that this was the hardest part of all, not coming up with the idea, showing them, not just once, as many times as it takes. In the 4th month, Shala arrived. Arte was standing by the kiln, counting the bricks from the last firing when Kibi brought the girl to him. Thin, dirty, with a broken cheekbone and eyes full of anger. Kibi said she was from Nar Ilu, a potter's daughter. She'd run away from the old man her father had sold her to as a wife. The old man beat her. She fled at night. 2 villages had turned her away. Here she was asking to stay. Arte looked at her. She looked back at him. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stood straight and looked at him as if challenging him.
Try to refuse me. Let's see what happens, Arte said. Stay. There's work. Shala nodded briefly, as if she hadn't expected any other answer, although of course she had. Arte saw her hands tremble when he said that word. Stay. Perhaps it was the first time in this world that anyone had said it to her. He put her to work with clay, not out of charity. He'd seen her hands, the hands of a potter, strong fingers accustomed to clay. She didn't need to be told how to knead it. She knew. But she didn't know how to use a foot-powered wheel. Arte built the simplest potter's wheel in 2 days. A wooden axle, a stone flywheel at the bottom, a pedal made of a plank. You press down with your foot and the wheel spins. Your hands are free, both hands.
Shala looked at this invention the way some people look at a sunset, with her mouth open and her eyes shining. She sat down at the wheel and, within an hour, made a pot that her father would have taken a whole day to make. Smooth, symmetrical, with thin walls. She took it off the wheel and held it in her hands. She didn't move. Arte thought she was about to cry. But she didn't cry. She smiled, widely, maliciously, triumphantly, and she said, "More." Arte showed her how to make a second pot, and a third, and a 10th. By the end of the first week, Shala had 30 pots. By the end of the second, she had learned to make flat plates and jugs with handles. By the end of the month, she was teaching 2 other women. Arte stood to the side and watched. This was the moment it had all been for. Not the pot, not the circle, but the fact that she was teaching others, that knowledge was leaving him and beginning to live a life of its own. Pabil looked at Shala with suspicion. She was an outsider, a woman, and she was doing things that only men had done before. Arte saw this and said nothing. He didn't interfere. 2 weeks later, Pabil came to Shala and asked her to make a crucible for smelting, of a specific shape and thickness. Shala made it. Pabil tested it. The crucible held up. The old one would crack after 2 firings. This one held. Pabil looked at Shala and gave a brief nod. She nodded back. The conversation was over. A reconciliation without words. Arte watched from around the corner of the hut and thought that some things didn't need to be explained. You just had to give people a common cause. The 5th month. Heat. The Nat River had receded so much that in some places it could be crossed on foot. The fields were drying up. Arte stood on the bank and looked at the water. The water level had dropped by 2 elbows over the past month. If it continued to fall, by the 7th month the irrigation ditches would dry up. The fields would die. The harvest would be lost. Winter would bring famine. He knew what to do. A shaduf, the simplest water-lifting mechanism, a lever with a counterweight, a bucket at one end, a stone at the other. You lower the bucket into the river. The stone pulls it back up. A person just guides it. Arte had seen shadufs in photographs from Egypt. He'd read about them in scholarly works. He knew the dimensions and proportions. But it's one thing to read about it. It's quite another to build one out of crooked sticks and ropes twisted from goat's wool. By the 6th month, the drought had really set in. The Nat River had run so dry that even the elders couldn't remember anything like it. The rocky bottom was exposed in the middle of the riverbed. The fish had moved farther downstream. The banks had dried up and cracked. Every day the wind carried fine yellow dust from the west that settled on everything. On their hair, on their food, on the water in open containers. The children coughed from the dust. The goats stopped giving milk. Arte woke up every morning and went straight to the river. He checked the water level.
He had marked the bank with a stick driven into the ground, notched to track the water level. A new notch every day. Lower every day. He did the math. They had 2 months left. If the level continued to drop at the same rate, in 2 months the shadufs wouldn't reach the water. The fields would dry up. The harvest would be lost. But Arte knew something the others didn't. He knew that grain could be counted. He began counting their supplies in the very first month. While everyone around him ate as much as they wanted, he went from hut to hut and asked, "How much grain do you have? How much do you eat each day? How many people are in your family?" People looked at him as if he were crazy. Why count grain? You eat grain while you have it. Then it's gone. Then you go hungry. Then maybe you die. That's how it's always been. Arte didn't argue. He counted. In his head. Because there was nothing to write it down on. Then he found a way. Clay tablets, small ones, no bigger than a fingernail. He would etch simple symbols onto them with a stick. A line was 1, a cross was 10, a circle was 100. Not the priest's pictograms. Simpler. Numbers. Plain numbers. He counted it all. The grain in every hut, the dried fish, dates, goat's milk that could be dried in the sun into hard lumps, meat of which there was almost none. And he came up with a number. If the village switched to a reduced ration, if every person received exactly as much as they needed to stay alive and work, no more, if the supplies were distributed evenly and no one was allowed to take more than their share, then the village would last 9 months, until the next possible harvest, if they were lucky with the rains. The figure was tenuous, fragile, like a dry clay wall. One blow and everything would crumble. But it was there. Arte gathered the villagers. He stood before them and said, "There will be a famine. Not in a year, in 2 months.
The neighboring villages are already starving. In 4 months, they'll come to us, not to ask, but to take. We have grain, we have water, we have time, but only if we start counting right now." The people listened in silence. Arte laid out his tablets before them. This much grain, this many people, this much per person per day. This many days we'll survive. The elder looked at the charts and said nothing. He didn't know how to read these symbols. No one did except Arte and Kibi. But they could see that the symbols were there, that behind them lay order, a system, something they'd never had before. The elder asked, "Do you want us to give you our grain?" Arte said no. "I want you to know how much grain you have, and for you to decide for yourselves how to divide it. I'm just keeping track." The elder thought for a long time. Then he said, "All right, count it." Arte conducted the first inventory in the village's history. He went around to every hut, every granary, every storage pit. He counted the sacks. He weighed them on homemade scales made from a stick and 2 bowls filled with stones of known weight. He recorded the numbers on tablets. Kibi walked with him and learned. The boy picked it up in no time. By the end of the 3rd day, he was already writing down the numbers himself in neat, even characters. Arte watched his hand trace the symbols on the wet clay and thought, "Here he is, the first scribe of the new world. He's 12 years old, has a cleft lip, and doesn't know what math is. But he just wrote the number 123, and that number will change everything." The distribution of grain became a daily ritual. In the morning, Anaya handed out a portion to each family from the communal granary. Arte determined the rations. 2 handfuls per adult, 1.5 per child over 5, 1 per child under 5, plus a handful of barley porridge cooked in a communal pot. People grumbled for the first 3 days, especially the men. They were used to eating until they were full. The reduced portion felt like a humiliation.
One of the peasants, a burly, sullen man named Zabar, came to Arte and said he wasn't going to obey some outsider who decided how much he could eat. Arte listened. Then he took out a chart and showed it to him. Here's your family, 5 people. Here's how much grain is needed for 5 people for 9 months. This is how much you have. Zabar, you can eat as much as you want. This is your grain.
But in 4 months it will run out, and then you'll come to me, and I won't give you any more, because I'll have exactly as much as is needed for those who kept track, not a single extra handful.
Zabar was silent. He stared at the sign. He couldn't read numbers, but he could count on his fingers, and the numbers on the sign matched what his fingers showed. He left in silence. The next morning he came for his ration like everyone else. Nanaya distributed the rations with such calm firmness that no one dared to argue. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't make threats. She simply stood by the granary with a measuring cup and gave everyone exactly what they were entitled to. No more, not a bit less. Arte watched her and thought he'd found his best manager in a woman who 6 months earlier had buried her daughter and couldn't count past 20. Now she could count to 1,000. He had taught her. In the evenings, after the village had fallen asleep, they would sit at the entrance to the granary, and Arte would check the records. Nanaya would hand him the tablets one by one. She would recite the numbers from memory. She remembered everything. Faces, names, families, who took what, who didn't come, who was sick, who had recovered. She didn't have numbers. She had something better. Absolute attentiveness to people. Arte once told her, "You know this village better than I ever will." She paused. Then she said, "This is my home." He replied, "I know." She looked at him for a long time. Then she went back to the signs. In the 7th month, famine struck. Not in Kaparsin, in the surrounding villages. 5 villages within a day's journey began to starve. Arte knew this would happen. He had been keeping track not only of his own supplies, but also of his neighbors' approximate harvests based on rumors, on the stories of those who came by, and on what he'd seen when he went to Kushar Bel to set up a kiln. The fields had dried up. The granaries were empty. People had started eating their seed grain. This meant that even if rain came, there would be nothing left to plant. A spiral of death. Arte had seen this in his history textbooks. Famine leads to eating seed grain. Eating seed grain leads to a lack of crops. A lack of crops leads to famine. The cycle closes. There is only one way to break it. Seeds from elsewhere. People began to arrive. At first in groups of 2 or 3, then in families. Emaciated, with grey faces and empty eyes.
They stood at the edge of the village and waited. They didn't ask for anything. They just stood there and waited. Arte saw how the residents of Kaparsin looked at them, with pity and fear,
because every extra mouth to feed meant less grain for their own people, because pity doesn't put food on the table. The elder came to Arte and said, "Send them away. Our grain is for our people." Arte said, "No, don't send them away." The elder raised his voice. He said that a stranger could count his pebbles as much as he wanted, but the village belonged to those who lived in it. Arte listened. Then he said one sentence. "In 2 months, we'll need a canal from the river 3,000 paces long." "You know how many hands that will take." The elder fell silent. He knew. Arte continued. "I won't give the grain away for free. I'll give it on credit. Every sack will be recorded. Every family that receives grain will work on the canal. 1 day's work for a measure of grain, not charity." An exchange. The elder thought. Then he asked, "What if they just take it and leave?" Arte replied, "Then they'll leave. But they won't leave. Because we have water, bricks, work. They have nothing. They'll stay." They stayed. In just 1 month, the population of Kaparsin grew by 200 people, then by another 100. Arte fed them, he counted them, he wrote their names on tags, he gave them work. Every morning, Anaya handed out grain. Every morning, Kibi kept track. Every day, people dug a canal. A new canal, a big one. 3,000 steps from the river to the fields, with a gradient of 1,000th, with brick walls, with 3 locks made of wooden gates. Arte marked it out with a rope tied with knots. Each knot was spaced 20 paces apart. Every 20 paces there was a mark on a stick to check the level. The water had to flow evenly. No stagnation, no rapids. Evenly. They dug the canal for 4 months. 300 people. Every day from dawn until noon. After noon, the heat made it impossible to work. Arte walked along the route and checked every section. He adjusted the slope. He pointed out where to widen it and where to narrow it. Kibi walked alongside the markers and took notes. How many steps had been dug? How many bricks had been laid? How many people were working? How much grain was distributed? Numbers, numbers, numbers. Arte lived by the numbers. They were his language, his weapon, his defense. As long as he counted, he was in control. As long as he was in control, he was needed. As long as he was needed, they wouldn't kill him.
Shala worked on equal footing with the men. She hauled bricks, she mixed mortar, and every evening she sat down at the potter's wheel and made pottery. Water pots, food bowls, storage jugs. People from the new families came to her and asked for them. She didn't refuse, but she didn't give them away for free either. In exchange for work, just as Arte had taught her. Everything was accounted for. Shala learned faster than anyone else. She was already keeping her own records. On little tags she molded herself. How many pots were made? How many were given away? How much clay was used? Arte saw her notes one evening and stopped. He stood there and watched. The symbols were crooked and not all of them were correct, but they were there. She was keeping track, all by herself, without his prompting. He told her, "You have a mistake right here." She looked at him. Her eyes narrowed. "Where?" He pointed it out. She corrected it, silently. She didn't thank him. She didn't apologize. She just corrected it and went back to work. Arte walked away and thought that this was the best reaction he could have hoped for. Not gratitude, not admiration, anger at her own mistake. It meant it was important to her, that the numbers had become her business, not his. In the 10th month, a man from the capital arrived in Kaparsin. Arte saw him from a distance. He didn't walk the way the peasants did. Upright, with his head held high. 2 men with spears followed behind him. His clothes were different. Not coarse linen, but fabric dyed a dark red. Around his neck hung a bronze plate with an embossed symbol. Arte didn't recognize the symbol, but he understood its significance by the way the village fell silent. The people stopped. They lowered their eyes. They retreated toward the walls of their huts. The elder stepped forward to meet him and bowed so low that his forehead nearly touched the ground. Kibi ran up to Arte and whispered, "He's a man of the king, a tax collector from the capital." The man stopped in the middle of the village and surveyed it. Arte saw his expression change. He had expected to see an ordinary village. Cracked mud walls, muddy ditches, scrawny goats. He saw something else. Brick walls along the canals, shadoufs on the river, a kiln with smoke rising from it, a potter's workshop where 3 women were working at potter's wheels.
neat rows of grain in the fields, a granary with a new roof made of 3 layers of reeds. His eyes lingered on the granary.
Arte understood. A granary means grain. Grain means tax. Tax is why he had come. The tax collector spoke with the elder. Arte stood to the side and listened. Over the past 10 months, his language skills had improved enough to understand almost everything. The tax collector demanded a share of the harvest, 1/5, as required by the king's law. The elder nodded and muttered that the harvest was poor, that there was a drought, that there weren't enough people, the usual story. Arte had heard the same thing from farmers in Kazakhstan a century ago. The same words. The collector listened with the expression of a man who'd heard this 1,000 times. Then he pointed at the granary and said something sharp. The elder turned pale. Arte stepped forward. The collector looked at him. For a second. 2. Arte saw surprise flash in his eyes. A stranger. Tall, fair-skinned, with sun-scorched shoulders and calloused hands. He looked like neither a peasant, nor a merchant, nor a priest. The collector asked who he was. The elder hesitated. Arte answered himself. "I am the one who built what you see." The collector raised an eyebrow. Arte continued. "I can give you 1/5 of the harvest, but I want you to pass on a message to the one who sent you. Tell him to send someone who can make decisions, not just count grain. Make decisions." The collector was silent. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that, especially by a stranger from the village. But he looked at the brick walls of the canal, the shadufs, and the fields, and saw something he hadn't seen in any other village during his 20 years of service. "All right," he nodded. He took the grain. He left. Arte stood there, watching him go. He knew he had just set in motion a process that could not be stopped. The collector would tell the story. He would tell not only about the grain, but also about the bricks, the canals, and the stranger who counts and builds. The rumor would reach the capital, the king, the priests, and then people would come with questions that could not be answered incorrectly. Kibbe stood nearby, looking down the road the collector had taken. Then he asked, "What will happen?" Arte replied, "More will come." Kibbe asked, "Are they bad?" Arte paused. Then he said, "They're neither bad nor good. They're strong, and we aren't yet." 3 months passed as they worked. Arte made the most of every day. He knew time was short. The canal was working. The fields yielded their first harvest using the new irrigation system. Arte did the math. The harvest was 3 times larger than usual for this area. Not because the soil had improved. The soil was the same. But the water came on time. In the right amount. To the right plots. Arte divided the fields into sections. Each section received water in turn, not all at once, according to a schedule. The first in the morning, the second at noon, the third in the evening. A simple rotation principle. It conserved water and gave each plot time to absorb the moisture. The farmers got used to the schedule within a week. After a month, they were already arguing among themselves about who should be watered first, and Arte had to introduce a lottery. Clay balls with numbers in a bag. You pull a ball, your number, your turn. No hard feelings. The school started by accident. Arte hadn't planned it. He was simply teaching Kibbe every evening. Numbers, symbols, how to measure distance with steps and a rope, how to determine a slope using water poured into a long trough, how to record the result. One evening he turned around and saw that 6 more children were sitting behind Kibbe. Children, between 8 and 13 years old. They were listening, silently, with their eyes wide open. Arte looked at them, then at Kibbe. Kibbe shrugged and smiled. Arte sighed. Then he took a stick and drew the numbers 1 through 10 on the ground. The 6 children repeated after him. A week later, there were 12 of them. 2 weeks later, 20. Arte taught them every evening after work, an hour before sunset. He taught them what he knew.
counting, simple calculations, how to write down numbers, how to add and subtract, how to measure. It wasn't a school in the sense that he knew the word. It was a circle around the campfire, a stick on the ground, the voices of children repeating numbers, and Arte standing before them with dusty hands and a hoarse voice, thinking that this is more important than the canal, more important than bricks, more important than anything he'd ever done. Because the canal can be destroyed, bricks can be broken, but what's in the minds of these 20 children can never be taken away. Never. Kiaga arrived in the 12th month, not to Arte, to the sick child, a child from one of the new families. Fever, vomiting. His stomach was swollen like a drum. His mother ran to Arte, screaming. Arte looked at the child and realized it wasn't an intestinal infection.
It was something else. He didn't know exactly what. He was an engineer, not a doctor. He knew the rules. Boiling water, salt, honey, and drinking in small sips. But the child couldn't drink. Every sip made him vomit. Arte stood over him and felt a cold, heavy helplessness rising inside him. He didn't know what to do. Kibi brought Kiaga. She came in quietly, short, thin, with huge dark eyes that took up half her face. The granddaughter of the healer Iltu. She was 22 years old but looked younger. She moved silently, like a shadow, like someone accustomed to being unnoticed. She approached the child. She placed her hand on his stomach. She pressed down. The child cried out. She pressed in a different spot. The child cried out even louder. Kiaga turned to Arte and said, "A stone in his stomach. Not in the stomach itself, in his intestine. It's stuck. If it doesn't come out, the child will die." Arte asked, "What should we do?" She said, "Oil. A lot of oil inside. And wait." Arte took some sesame oil from their supplies. Kiaga fed it to the child drop by drop. Then she placed a hot cloth on his stomach. Then she began to press, slowly, gently, in circular motions. It took 6 hours. By morning, the child had emptied his bowels, with a scream, with blood, but alive. Kiaga sat next to him, pale with exhaustion. Arte sat across from her. He looked at her and didn't see a folk healer, not a superstitious girl spouting incantations. He saw a doctor. She made her diagnosis through palpation. She knew anatomy, not from textbooks, from her hands, from thousands of touches on sick bodies over all those years spent with her grandmother. Arte said to her, "You want to study?" She lowered her eyes. She was silent. Then she said quietly, "Grandma says my knowledge comes from the spirits. What if I start writing it down? The spirits will leave." Arte paused. Then he said, "Your willow bark reduces fever not because the spirits decided so, but because there's something in the bark that fights the fever. That something is always in the bark, even if you don't ask the spirits, even if you write it down on a tablet." Kiaga looked at him for a long time. Arte continued, "I don't know as much as you do about herbs and illnesses, but I know how to record things, how to compare, how to verify. This decoction helped 3 out of 5 patients. This one helped 1 out of 5. So the first one is better. It's not the spirits speaking. The numbers speak." Kiaga remained silent for a long time. Then she said, "Show me how to write it down." Arte took the tablet and the stylus and began to demonstrate. That was the day Arte realized that his village was turning into something more than just a village. He had builders. He had potters. He had farmers who used irrigation. He had scribes. Now he had a doctor.
20 students were counting and writing. 300 people worked on a schedule and received grain according to their rations. A canal, 3,000 paces long, carried water to the fields. The kiln produced bricks. The workshop produced pottery. The granaries were full. Once it had been a village of 15 huts where 1 in 3 children did not live to see their 5th birthday. Now it was something else. This something else did not yet have a name. That evening, Nanaya approached Arte. She stood in the doorway of his hut and said nothing. Arte looked up from his tablets. She spoke. "He's come again." Arte didn't understand at first. "Who?" Nanaya said. "A man from the capital, but not a tax collector. Someone else, with the king's seal. He spoke with the elder. He said the stranger must present himself in the capital, or die." Arte set down his stylus. He looked at Nanaya. She stood upright. Her face was impassive. Only her hands. Her hands were clenched into fists. Arte asked, "When?" Nanaya said, "By the next moon." Arte counted in his head. 20 days. The journey to the capital takes 4 days. That means 16 days to prepare. He nodded. "All right, I'll go." Nanaya didn't move. Then she said quietly, "I know you'll go. I know you can't help but go. But know this, if you don't come back, I won't wait. I'll come after you." Arte looked at her. She wasn't joking. He could tell. He said, "I'll come back." She turned and walked away. Arte sat in the empty hut and thought. The capital, the king, the priests, everything he'd been hiding from behind the canals and brick walls. It had come. He knew it would come. He'd just hoped it would be later. For 16 days he'd been preparing. Not for the trip, for the village to function without him. He spent 3 days with Kibi. He explained every calculation, every number in the ledgers, every measurement in the canal. Kibi took notes. He listened. He nodded. He was serious and focused, like a grown man. He was 12 years old. Arte spent 2 days with Pabil. He showed him how to fire the kiln without him, how much fuel, what temperature, when to take it out. Pabil nodded silently.
He already knew all this, but he let Arte go over it again because he could see that Arte needed to. Arte spent a day with Shala. She listened as if he were insulting her with these instructions. Then she said,
"I know. Go. Don't waste my time." Arte opened his mouth to say something else. She turned her back on him and sat down behind the wheel. The conversation was over. The journey to the capital took 4 days. Arte walked with Kibi and 2 men from the village whom the elder had sent as escorts, or as witnesses. Arte wasn't sure. The road ran along the Naat River, past villages that looked just like Kaparsin had a year ago. Cracked mud walls, muddy ditches, and skinny children with swollen bellies. Arte looked at them and said nothing. Kibi was silent too. He saw the same things Arte did, and in his 13-year-old eyes lay something mature and heavy, an understanding that the world is big, that there is a lot of pain in it, and that one village isn't enough. On the 2nd day of their journey, they passed by Nar Ilu, the very village Shala had come from. Arte saw a new ditch on the outskirts. His ditch. The elderly man to whom he had shown the sketch in the sand during that first month. He'd built it. A little crooked. The slope wasn't perfect, but he'd built it. Water was flowing. Murky, but it was flowing. Arte stopped for a moment. He looked at it. Then he walked on. He didn't say anything, but Kibi saw his face. And on that face was something like the look a father has when watching his child's first steps. On the third day, the road widened. Wheel tracks appeared. Donkey caravans. More people. Merchants with bundles on their backs. Shepherds with flocks of scrawny sheep. Soldiers. Arte saw the first real soldiers of this world. Spears with bronze tips. Shields made of wood covered with leather. Helmets of thick leather with bronze strips. They marched in squads of 12 and looked at Arte with the same expression he had grown accustomed to seeing. Who is he? Where is he from? Why is he fair-skinned? Arte lowered his gaze and kept walking. Don't draw attention. Don't stick your neck out. He's no warrior. Any one of these soldiers could kill him with one hand. The capital came into view on the fourth day. First, the smell. Thick and heavy. Smoke, manure, searing meat, urine, dust, all mixed together. Then the sound. The rumble of thousands of voices, the shouts of merchants, the clang of hammers, the braying of donkeys.
Then the walls, tall, made of adobe, with towers every 100 paces, gates made of thick logs reinforced with bronze strips. At the gates stood guards in leather armor. They let Arte through after one of his escorts showed a clay tablet bearing a seal, a decree from the king. Arte entered the city. The capital of Ur-Kash was larger than he had expected. 2,020 inhabitants, perhaps more. Narrow streets, 2- and 3-story clay houses, markets at every intersection. The smell of spices, rotting fruit, and human sweat. Children ran between the legs of donkeys. Women carried baskets of bread on their heads. Old men sat by the walls, chewing on something green. Arte walked along, looking around. Through the eyes of an engineer. No sewer system. Water from open canals running right through the city. Everything flows into the canals. Rainwater, slop, sewage. He saw children drinking from the same canal into which, further upstream, a woman was emptying a chamber pot. He saw flies. Thousands of flies. On the meat at the market. On the faces of sleeping children. On the wounds of beggars sitting by the temple walls. Arte knew that people died every day in this city, from diseases that could be prevented in a week, if you knew how. He knew how. But here he was not in charge. Here he was a stranger who had been summoned to the king, summoned not to teach, summoned to observe, and to decide what to do with him. The palace stood in the center of the city on a hill. Its clay walls were covered with plates of gilded bronze. They glinted in the sun so brightly that it hurt to look at them. Arte squinted. The architecture was rough but imposing. Thick walls, low ceilings, narrow windows. Not for beauty, for defense. It was a fortress masquerading as a palace, or a palace that had grown out of a fortress. Guards stood at the entrance. 6 men with spears longer than they were tall. Arte was led inside through 3 courtyards. In each courtyard there were more guards, more officials, more people with important-looking faces and bronze seals around their necks. Kibbe walked beside him and whispered, "Don't look them in the eye. Don't speak first. Wait until they ask." Arte nodded. He knew the rules. Different words, a different language, but the rules were the same. Those in power like it when people approach them with their heads bowed. They led him into a hall, a large one, dimly lit. Thick columns of fired bricks supported the ceiling. Arte looked at the columns and noted to himself, "Fired brick, good quality, smooth. So they know how to fire bricks here, but only for the palace. That knowledge hasn't reached the villages, or they weren't allowed to use it." At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform, sat a young man, about 25 years old,
thin, with dark, deep-set eyes. On his head was a low bronze crown. Over his shoulders was a white linen cloak with a gold border. King Taharan IV. Ate looked at him and saw not a fearsome ruler. He saw a weary young man who didn't sleep at night. Dark circles under his eyes. His fingers moved nervously on the armrest. His gaze was sharp but anxious. This man was afraid. Ate didn't know exactly of what, but the fear was there, just beneath the surface, like a crack in an adobe wall. To the right of the throne stood an old man, tall, upright, with a shaved head and a long white beard braided into 3 plaits. He wore dark blue linen embroidered with silver thread. The high priest Enmesh-Zar. Ate recognized him not by his face, but by his eyes. They were the eyes of a man who was smarter than anyone else in that room and knew it. Cold, calm, appraising. He did not look at Ate as if he were a stranger or a curiosity. He looked at him the way a scientist looks at a specimen under a magnifying glass, with interest, with caution, and with a readiness to crush it if the specimen proved dangerous. To the left of the throne sat a woman. Ate didn't notice her right away. She was sitting slightly in the shadows, below the throne, in a small dark wood chair. She wore a dress of white linen so thin it looked like a cloud. Her dark hair was tucked under a golden net. Her face was serene, beautiful in that kind of beauty that doesn't shout about itself but simply is, like pure water, like a wall laid with precision. Queen Nisaba. She looked directly at Ate, without fear, without curiosity, with something else, with attention, deep and focused, as if she had been listening to him even before he spoke. The king spoke first. His voice was young but well modulated. He asked who Ate was, where he had come from, why. Ate answered simply. He was a stranger from a distant land. He had come by chance. He was a builder. He knew how to dig canals and bricks and how to count grain. He built this in the village of Kapar Sin. He was ready to show them. The king listened. His expression did not change.
Then he said,
"I've been told you're a sorcerer." Ate replied, "I am no sorcerer. I calculate. If one calculates correctly, there is no need for sorcery." Silence hung in the hall. Ate saw the corner of Enmesh-Sar's lips twitch. Not a smile, the shadow of a smile. He understood. The old man understood. Ate had said what the priests had been hiding for 1,000 years, that knowledge works on its own, without intermediaries. Enmesh-Sar spoke. His voice was quiet and steady. He asked Ate how he knew how to build channels and who had taught him. Ate told the truth. He had been taught by people in his country, many people, for many years. Enmesh-Sar asked where that country was. Ate said, "Far away, very far away." Enmesh-Sar asked if it was possible to get there. Ate replied, "No, it's not possible." Enmesh-Sar nodded, slowly, the way a person nods who already knew the answer before asking. Ate felt a chill in his stomach. This old man knows something. Something about foreigners from distant lands. Something that Ate doesn't yet understand. The king asked what Ate wanted. Ate replied, "I want to build." The king asked, "What exactly?" Ate said, "Canals. Roads, brick kilns, schools for scribes, hospitals, granaries that won't crumble in a single summer, houses where people can live, not die." The king listened. Nisaba listened. and Meshsar listened. The hall was silent. Arte spoke and heard his voice echoing in this dimly lit stone hall, and he thought, this is it. It's now or never. If they say no, they'll take him back to the village, and he'll live another year or two until the soldiers come. If they say yes, he'll get a chance. One chance. Not for himself, for all those people outside the palace walls who drink from filthy ditches and bury every third child. The king was silent for a long time. Then he turned to Enmeshsar. The priest leaned close to the king's ear and whispered something. Arte couldn't make it out. The king nodded. Then he looked at Arte and said, Nomu Kapar Sin needs a ruler. The previous one died from the black water. I will give you this Nom. An entire province, 12 villages, 4,000 people. Show me a miracle within a year. If you do, you'll receive a second Nom. If not, don't come back. Arte understood what don't come back meant. Not to the village. Not to this world. He bowed. Not too low, just enough to show respect, but not so low as to show weakness. It was harder than building a canal.
The king waved his hand. The audience was over. Arte turned to leave, and at that moment he heard a voice. Quiet. A woman's. Queen Nisaba. She spoke a single sentence. Tell me how you count grain? Arte stopped. He turned around. He looked at her. She was looking at him, directly, without a hint of a smile, but with something in her eyes that Arte had seen before. In Kibi when he first wrote a number. In Shala when she first spun her leg in a circle. In Kiaga when she first recorded her symptoms. Hunger. Pure hunger for knowledge. Arte replied, with pleasure, if the queen permits. Nisaba nodded, once, briefly. Then she turned away. Arte left the hall. Behind him, Enmeshsar watched him go. For a long time, motionless, like a cat watching a bird that doesn't yet know it's being watched. Arte spent 3 more days in the capital. He was waiting for the documents, a clay tablet bearing the king's seal granting him authority over the gnome. The tablet took a long time to make. The scribe carved each character with solemn slowness. Arte sat in the room assigned to him in the palace's guest wing and waited. The room was small. The walls were made of sun-dried brick. A narrow window in the ceiling. A bed made of reed mats. Better than his hut in Kapar Sin. Worse than his apartment in Novosibirsk. He wasn't thinking about the apartment. He was thinking about the canals. About how many bricks he would need for 12 villages. About where to get wood for the shadufs. About how many people he needed to train in a year. He counted in his head and drew with a stick on the dirt floor. On the second day of waiting, Nisaba arrived. Not alone, with 2 maids who remained outside the door. She entered his room and sat down on the only stool. Arte stood up. She said, "Sit down." He sat down on the couch. She said, "Show me." Arte took the stick and drew 10 vertical lines on the floor. Then he crossed out the first one with a horizontal line. 1. She watched. He continued. He showed her the decimal system. Units, tens, hundreds, simple things, addition, subtraction, how to write the number 473 using 3 digits. Nisaba listened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't ask any questions. She just listened. Her eyes followed the stick, tracking every line. Half an hour later, she took the stick from his hands. Their fingers touched for a second.
Arte pulled his hand away. Nisaba wrote down the number. 291. Correct.
On the first try.
Artie said, "That's right." She looked up at him. There was something in her eyes that made Arte force himself to look away. Not because he was ashamed, because it was dangerous. She was the king's wife, in a country where a glance at the queen could get your hands cut off. Nisaba said, "No one taught me how to count. The priests say women don't need to know, that the gods gave numbers to men." Arte was silent. She continued, "I'm 26 years old. I read the priests' tablets. I know the history of 7 generations of kings. I know the laws and trade agreements. But I don't know how much grain my city needs for the winter. Not because I can't find out, because they won't let me." Arte listened. He saw before him an intelligent woman trapped in a world where her intellect was considered a deformity. He'd seen this before. In another century, in another country. Female engineers who were told they'd be better off in administrative roles. Female scientists who were denied grants. A different scale, the same wall. He said, "If the Queen wants, I can come and teach. Once a week, once a month, whenever there's time." Nisaba was silent. Then she said, "Write to me. I can read." Arte understood. "Don't come. It's too conspicuous, too dangerous. Write. On slates. Lessons, promptly, numbers. Pass them on secretly." He nodded. She stood up, walked to the door. She stopped, didn't turn around. She said, "You're the first person to talk to me like this, as if I were someone who can understand." Arte replied, "Because you can." She left. The door closed. Arte sat on the cot and stared at the number 291, scrawled by her hand on the dirt floor. Then he wiped it away with his foot. Because if anyone saw that number and found out the Queen had written it, the consequences would be such that no channel could save him. On the third day, he was handed a tablet bearing a seal. Arte took it in his hands. It was heavy, smooth, with deeply carved symbols that he could already read. "In the name of Taharan IV, King of Kings of Ulkash, the foreigner known as Arte is appointed ruler of the Nom of Kapar Sin, with the right to judge, build, and collect taxes for a term of 1 year." Arte turned the tablet over in his hands. A year. 1 year. 12 months to work a miracle. He recalled his projects in Kazakhstan. There, just getting the paperwork approved took a year. Here, there were no documents, no approvals.
There was a clay tablet with a seal, and exactly 12 months to live. He put the tablet in his bag and left the palace. Kibi and his escorts were waiting for him at the gate, and one more person.
A guard. A young man of about 20, with a spear and a leather breastplate. He said he'd been assigned to Arte by order of the king, to guard him, or to watch him. Arte nodded. He said, "Welcome." The young man didn't reply. The whole way back, he walked 3 paces behind and remained silent. Arte didn't look back. He walked and thought. 12 villages, 4,000 people. 1 year. Canals, stoves, schools, hospitals, records, scribes, roads, everything from scratch. Everything made of sticks, stones, and clay. Everything built by the hands of people who can't read, who keep track of things with notches on a stick, and who bury every 3rd child. Arte counted in his head. Kilometers of canal, tons of bricks, hours of instruction, sacks of grain. He counted and couldn't stop. The numbers were his anchor, his wall, his moat that kept fear at bay from his reason, because if he stopped counting, he might start thinking about how he was alone, completely alone, in a world that didn't exist on his maps, in a world where a guard was watching him, where he'd been given a year to live, where his predecessor had been burned. Arte returned to Caparsin as the ruler of the Nom, and the first thing he did was sit down on the ground by the canal and remain silent for 2 hours. Nanaya didn't approach him. Shala didn't approach him. Even Kibi kept his distance. They saw his face, the face of a man who had just shouldered a mountain and was now counting how many steps remained to the summit. Then he stood up, called out to Kibi. He said, "Take the tablets. We're going through the villages, all 12 of them. I need to see each one with my own eyes." The tour of the Nom took 14 days. Arte walked on foot. Kibi walked beside him, carrying a sack of clay tablets on his back. The king's guard walked behind them, saying nothing. Arte visited into every village. He looked around. He counted. He took notes. The first village north of Caparsin, 60 people. 1 ditch, murky, no slope. The water was stagnant. 3 children with swollen bellies, 1 old man with a non-healing ulcer on his leg. The granary is half empty, enough grain for 2 months, maybe 3 if they cut back on rations. The second village, 80 people. 2 ditches, both clogged. The fields are abandoned. No seed grain. They ate it all during the month of famine.
The third, 40 people. Half of them are sick. Water from a puddle by the road. Arte stood at the edge of this puddle and watched. A goat was drinking on one side. A woman was drawing water from the other side. A child was urinating 20 paces up the slope. Everything was flowing into the same puddle. Arte wrote 3 words on a tablet. Water, drainage, urgent. 12 villages, 4,000 people. Arte sat in Caparsin after his inspection tour and laid out the slates in front of him. Kibi sat nearby and waited. Arte was tallying the figures. The total grain supply for the entire Nom, the number of sick people, the number of children under 5, the number of available workers, the number of tools. The numbers were grim. There wasn't enough grain. There were too many sick people. There were almost no tools. In theory, there were enough workers, but half of them were too weak from malnutrition. Arte rubbed his face with his palms. Then he said to Kibi, "I need elders, 1 for each village. People who will do what I say, not because they believe, but because they saw the results in Caparsin." Kibi asked, "Where can we find such people?" Arte replied, "Among those who came to us during the month of famine. They saw it. They know. Find me 12 people who know how to listen and aren't afraid to work." Kibi nodded and left. 3 days later, Arte had 11 elders. He couldn't find the 12th. For the 12th village, the one farthest south in the Nom, they had to assign Pabil. The blacksmith didn't want to leave Caparsin. He was used to his furnace, to his crucible, to his corner of the workshop. Arte sat down with him and explained, "I need someone in Durshag, someone who understands fire, someone who can set up a kiln and fire the first bricks, someone who won't be scared and run away when the locals start talking about demons. You're the only one I know." Pabil was silent for a long time. Then he stood up and left. In the morning he came back with a bundle of belongings on his back and said, "Show me the way." Arte showed him. Pabil left. His apprentices stayed in Caparsin and continued working on the kiln. Arte lost his best builder, but he gained a foothold in the south of the Nom.
It was a fair trade. A difficult one, but fair. Arte devised a plan, simple and strict. The first 3 months, water. In every village, a new drinking water channel diverted from the muddy springs. Settling tanks, boiling.
He already knew how to do this with his eyes closed. Kibi wrote instructions on 12 tablets, all identical, word for word. Each foreman received his own tablet and a verbal explanation from Arte personally. Where to dig, how deep, what slope, how to check the water's purity. A simple test. Pour it into a white bowl. If you can see the bottom at the depth of a palm, the water is safe to drink. If you can't see it, let it settle some more. Arte repeated this to each foreman 3 times. Then he made them repeat it. Then he made them demonstrate with their hands. Then he let them go. The second 3 months. Bricks. Every village had a kiln. Arte couldn't set up 12 kilns on his own. He physically couldn't. He chose 3 key villages. Kapar Sin in the north, Dur Shag in the south, where Pabil stood, and Mar Eshu in the center of the Nom. The largest village after Kapar Sin, 400 people. There, Arte built a kiln himself in 6 days with the help of the locals. He demonstrated the firing process. He left the village elder with instructions. The other villages received bricks from these 3 locations. It wasn't ideal. It was a long way to haul them, but it was enough for the first year. The third 3 months. Canals. That was the hardest part. Arte couldn't build a full-fledged irrigation system for 12 villages in 3 months. That would have taken years. But he could do one thing. Connect the 3 nearest villages to the river via a single canal. 3 villages, 1 canal, 6,000 steps, with 2 locks and branch canals. This brought water to fields that had lain barren without irrigation. Arte staked out the route in 4 days. A rope with knots, pegs every 20 steps, the water level in the long trough. He checked and double-checked. A mistake in the slope of even 1 step per 1,000 and the water would pool, or flow the wrong way, or wash away the bank. There were no mistakes. The last 3 months. Schools and record-keeping. In every village with an elder, there must be someone who knows how to count and keep records. Arte couldn't train 12 scribes at the same time, but he had Kibi. And Kibi had students, the top 5 out of 20 at the Kapar Sin school. Arte sent them out in pairs to key villages, with tablets, with a set of tokens, with instructions. Count grain, count people, count the sick, record the data, bring the tablets to Kapar Sin every month. Arte would compile the data, the big picture. How much grain is in the Nom? How many people? How many are healthy? How many are sick? Where there are shortages? Where there are surpluses? The first accounting system in the history of Urkash to cover an entire Nom. Ki Aga worked non-stop. Arte sent her out to the villages with a supply of dried herbs and a set of tablets. She went from village to village. She examined the sick. She recorded their symptoms. She treated them with whatever she had. Willow bark for fever, mint for vomiting, clean water and salt for dehydration. She kept records just as Arte had taught her. The patient's name, age, symptoms, what she gave them, how many days it took for their condition to improve or worsen. After 2 months, she had 43 tablets, 43 medical histories. The first medical records in the history of this world. Arte read her notes in the evenings and saw patterns that Ki Aga hadn't yet noticed. Villages further upstream get sick less often. Villages further downstream get sick more often. Children under 3 get sick more often than adults. People who drink boiled water get sick 5 times less often than those who drink raw water. He showed her these figures. She looked at the cards laid out in a row. She was silent for a long time. Then she looked up.
It's not spirits. It's water. Arte nodded. Kiaga looked at the cards again. Then she said quietly, Grandma was wrong. Arte replied, Grandma was right that willow bark helps. She was wrong about why. Kiaga nodded. She stood up and went to the next patient. Over the past few months, Shala had turned into someone else. Not that dirty, angry girl who had arrived with a broken cheekbone. She had become a master craftswoman. She ran a workshop of 5 women and 2 men. They made pottery, bricks for small-scale construction, chimney pipes, roof tiles, which weren't yet mass-produced, but which Arte planned to introduce in the 2nd year. Shala kept the records. She accounted for materials. She assigned tasks. She scolded those who produced defective work. Her voice had become firm and confident. She no longer asked for permission. She made decisions. Arte looked at her and saw a leader production manager. In another life, she would have run a factory. One evening, he was sitting by the workshop checking Shala's inventory sheets. She came over and sat down next to him, silently. He kept checking.
She said, "You're always counting." He replied, "Yes." She said, "Do you ever stop?" He looked at her. She wasn't smiling. But there was something in her eyes that was both warm and angry at the same time, as if she were angry at him for not noticing something obvious. Artie replied, "Sometimes I stop, when I'm asleep." She snorted. She stood up. Then she said to his back, "You're a fool. A smart fool. That's the worst kind." Artie turned around, but she was already walking away at a brisk pace with her back straight. He watched her go and thought that she was probably right. But there was no time to think about it. Letters from Nisaba arrived once a month, small tablets wrapped in cloth, brought by a merchant from the capital. Artie sent his own letters back with the same merchant. Each tablet contained a problem. Calculate how many sacks of grain are in the granary if each sack weighs 3 measures and the granary holds 120 sacks. Answer in a month. 360 measures. Correct. A new problem, a bit more complicated. If the city consumes 8 sacks a day, how many days will it last on a supply of 1,000 sacks? Answer: 125 days. Correct. Correct again. Nisaba was never wrong. Not once. Artie sat with her tablets and thought. This woman, in this world, with that mind, locked away in a palace between a dim-witted husband and a cunning priest, counting in secret, like a criminal, because knowledge is forbidden to her. He put her tablets into a separate little bag and hid it under the couch. If anyone found it, better not to think about it. 6 months passed like one long, unbroken day. Artie had lost 10 kilograms. His skin had darkened from the sun. His hands had grown so calloused that he no longer felt minor cuts. His hair had grown out, and he tied it back with a strip of leather. He no longer looked like a stranger. He looked like a man of this land, tanned, muscular, with eyes narrowed against the dust and sun. Only his height gave him away. He was a head taller than most of the locals, and his gait. He didn't walk like a peasant, not like a priest, not like a soldier. He walked along the canal, looking at the water and the canal walls with that gaze that Kibbe had once described with a word in the local language, something like reading the land. Artie didn't argue. The description was accurate. The illness came at night, as always. Artie woke up to a knock on the hut door. Kibbe was standing in the doorway, pale. He said, "In Mar Eshu, people are getting sick."
A lot. Artie got up. He got dressed. He grabbed his bag.
Clean cloth, salt, honey, dried mint, boiled water in 2 leather pouches. He stepped out into the darkness. It was a 2-hour brisk walk to Mar Eshu. Arte walked without stopping. Kibby ran alongside him. A guard from the king's retinue trudged behind them. When they arrived, it was still dark. Arte saw bonfires. 4 bonfires at the edges of the village. People were sitting near each one. People were lying down. He approached the nearest one. 7 people lay on reed mats. 2 children, 3 women, 2 men, all with the same symptoms. Vomiting, watery, frequent diarrhea, sunken eyes, grey skin. Arte recognized these symptoms. He'd seen them in textbooks. He'd read about them in monographs on the history of epidemics. Cholera, or something very similar. Black water, as they called it here. Arte acted quickly, without thinking. The reflexes he'd developed over the past year in this world kicked in on their own. He found the village elder, a young man named Giru, whom he himself had appointed 4 months ago. Giru was frightened. He spoke quickly and incoherently. "The first person fell ill yesterday morning, an old man. By evening, 4 more. By 11 o'clock, 1 child had already died." Arte stopped him. He asked where they got their water. Giru pointed to the canal, that very one, the new one, the clean one, with brick walls. Arte walked along the canal, shining his torch ahead. Kibby walked beside him. After 300 steps, Arte stopped. He looked down. In the torchlight, he saw it. The canal wall had caved in. The soil on the side had collapsed. Water had flowed into the canal from a nearby ravine. And in that ravine, Arte raised his torch higher. A dead goat lay, bloated, with its ribs showing. It had probably been lying there for a week. The rain had washed everything that had leaked out of it straight into the canal, straight into the drinking water. Arte returned to the village. He gathered everyone who could stand. He said, "Don't drink the water from the canal. No one, not a single sip. Only boiled water, only from our reserves. Gather all the sick in one place, separate them from the healthy. No one is to enter the sick quarters without clean hands. Clean hands are hands washed with hot water. Bury everything that comes out of the sick, deeply, far from the water." The people listened. Some nodded. Some looked on skeptically. An old man said, "We need to call the priest." Arte said, "Call him." But while the priest is on his way, we'll give the sick water and bury the waste. One thing doesn't get in the way of the other. The old man thought about it and agreed. Arte thought that he had finally learned how to talk to these people, not to argue, not to deny their faith, but simply to add action to it. He summoned Kiagu on the 2nd day. She arrived in the evening, with a bag of herbs and a stack of clean tablets. Arte put her in charge of the sick. She took them all under her care. 23 people by that point. She gave them drinks. She kept watch. She took notes. Who drank, how much they drank, when they vomited, when they had a bowel movement, how many hours later they felt better or worse. She worked for 3 days straight without sleep. Arte saw her swaying on her feet and made her lie down for 2 hours. She lay down. An hour later, she got up. She told him she couldn't sleep. She went back to the patients. Of the 23 patients, 4 died. 2 children and 2 elderly people. Arte stood over the bodies and said nothing. 4. He could have said that without his methods, 15 would have died. He could have said that 19 survivors was a victory. But he didn't say it. Because 4 dead are 4 dead. Numbers don't help here. Kiaga stood beside him. She was silent too.
Then she asked quietly, "I could have saved them, if I'd known more." Arte replied, "Maybe, maybe not. We do what we can." She looked at him. There were no tears in her eyes. There was determination, firm and cold. She said, "Teach me more." Arte nodded. He repaired the canal, removed the goat, filled in the ravine, reinforced the wall. Then he walked the entire length of the canal from start to finish. 6,000 steps. He checked every meter, every joint, every sluice gate. He found 2 more weak spots where the wall could sag. He reinforced them. He returned to Kaparsin. He gathered the elders. He said, "Check every canal once every 10 days, the entire length, every joint. If the wall has sagged, if the soil has shifted, if something has fallen into the water, shut it off immediately. Repair it. Only then reopen it." The elders nodded. They took notes. Arte knew that half of them would forget in a month, but the other half would remember. And that was enough. News of the epidemic reached the capital faster than Arte had expected. A guard sent by the king dispatched a messenger. Arte saw him hand a clay tablet to a foot courier early that morning.
He didn't interfere. That was the guard's job, to watch and report. Arte knew the rules of the game. 10 days later, a reply arrived. Not a tablet, a man, an official from the capital, young, nervous, with a bronze seal around his neck. He said that the high priest Enmesh-Zar demanded a report. How many had fallen ill? How many had died? Why? Arte gave the report, on 5 tablets, with numbers, with dates, with reasons. A dead goat in a ravine, a collapsed wall, contaminated water, 4 the dead, 19 survivors. The official took the tablets. He read them. He looked up at Arte. He asked, "You're not writing in our characters?" Arte replied, "I'm writing in numbers. Numbers are the same for everyone." The official thought for a moment. Then he asked, "Will you teach me?" Arte looked at him. The young man was about 22 years old, intelligent eyes, clean hands, not a peasant, not a soldier, a scribe, trained at a priestly school, but with hungry eyes. Arte said, "I'll teach you, if you stay for 3 days." The official stayed. 3 days later, he left for the capital with 5 tablets for Enmesh-Zara and 10 tablets for himself, along with the arithmetic lessons Arte had been giving to Nisaba. Arte didn't know whether this young man would become an ally or an enemy, but he knew that every person who could count using his system was another crack in the wall of the priestly monopoly. In the 10th month of the Nom's reign, Arte received 2 pieces of news in a single day. The first came from a merchant from the capital, a tablet from Nisaba, but not with a task, rather a warning. Prince Ashtur, the king's older brother, was gathering supporters. The northern gnomes were on his side. He says that Taharan is weak, that a foreigner at court is a disgrace, that the gods have turned their backs on a king who listens to a godless man. Nisaba wrote dryly and precisely, without emotion, just as she wrote numbers, facts, dates, names. Arte read the tablet twice. Then he hid it. Then he took it out and read it a 3rd time. Rebellion. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Kibi brought the second piece of news. Step riders had come to the village. 3 of them, on horses, short and shaggy. Men in leather jackets with long hair braided into plaits. They didn't threaten anyone. They didn't rob anyone. They stood at the edge of the village and watched. At the canal, at the brick walls, at the shadufs, at the fields. Then one of them asked in broken local dialect, "Who did this?"
Kibby pointed at Ate. The stepman looked at him for a long time. Then he nodded. He turned his horse around and rode away. Ate asked Kibby, "Do they come often?" Kibby said, "This is the first time. They used to be afraid." Ate thought to himself, "The stepmen have stopped being afraid. That means they've sensed weakness. Or perhaps the opposite. They've seen value. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they know. They know about him, about the canals, about the village that isn't starving when everyone else is. This attention. Attention is danger. A third party in a game that already had enough players. Ate couldn't fight. He didn't know how. He didn't want to. He had no soldiers. He had peasants with hoes and scribes with tablets. But he could think and calculate. He gathered the elders. He said, "There's a rebellion in the north. There might be a war. We need to be ready, not for battle, to weather the storm. Grain, water, walls, people. Let's take stock. Let's plan. Let's prepare." The elders listened. They were peasants. They knew war only from one side, the side of those through whose lands the army marched, those whose fields were burned, those whose women were taken away. They knew that war was not a battle. War was the famine after the battle. Ate spoke their language, not of swords and spears. He spoke of sacks of grain and measures of water. He began building granaries, real ones, made of brick, with thick walls and roofs of 2 layers of reeds and a layer of clay plaster. 3 granaries in Kaparsin, 1 each in Mar Eshu and Durshag. Each could hold enough grain to feed 400 people for 3 months. Ate had done the math. If the war lasted half a year and the fields were burned, the reserves would be enough to keep them from starving. If there were no war, the reserves would serve as a safety net in case of a crop failure. In any case, it made sense to build them. The King's Guard watched the construction of the granaries with suspicion. He asked Ate why so many were needed. Ate replied, "Because grain spoils in earthen pits, rats, moisture, mold. A brick granary civilized grain 3 times longer." The guard thought for a moment. He nodded. He jotted something down on his tablet. Ate didn't know what he had written, the truth or his suspicion. It didn't matter. The granaries were being built. The 11th month. A messenger arrived from the capital.
Not from the king, from Enmeshzar. The priest invited Arte to the temple of Shamar for a conversation. It wasn't an order, it was an invitation. Arte understood the difference. An order meant authority. An invitation meant interest. Enmeshzara wanted to talk. Not at court. Not in the king's presence. One-on-one. Arte thought about it for 3 days. Then he said to Kibby, "Get ready. We're going to the capital." The temple of Shamar stood on the eastern edge of the capital. Tall, stepped. 4 tiers of adobe bricks rose toward the sky and a fire burned at the top. Arte looked up and gazed at it. A ziggurat. He'd read about them. He'd seen photographs of reconstructions. But standing at the foot of a living, functioning ziggurat was something else entirely. It was like standing before something that shouldn't exist but does. The heat melted the air above the summit, and the fire shimmered in the haze as if it were alive. Arte stepped inside. Enmeshzar was waiting for him in the lower hall, not in the main hall, in the library, a small room. The walls were lined with shelves. On the shelves were hundreds of clay tablets. The smell of dry clay and old oil from the lamps. Enmeshzar sat on a stone bench against the wall. A bronze tray stood on the floor in front of him. On the tray were 2 bowls of wine,
He motioned for Ate to the bench across from him. Ate sat down. Kibi remained outside the door. They sat in silence. Enmesh-Zar looked at Ate. Ate looked at Enmesh-Zar. Two people who understood each other better than they would have liked. The priest spoke first. He said, "In 1 year, you've accomplished more than the previous Nom ruler did in 20 years. Ate replied, "The previous ruler didn't know how to count." Enmesh-Zar nodded. Then he said, "My people tell me about your schools. The children are learning that are not ours. They count using numbers that are not ours. Do you understand what that means?" Ate replied, "It means that in 10 years your symbols will be obsolete." Enmesh-Zar was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You're saying this to my face, in my temple?" Ate replied, "I'm telling the truth. You're a smart man. You already know this. I'm just saying it out loud." Enmesh-Zar stood up. He walked over to one of the shelves. From the bottom shelf, he took out something wrapped in oiled cloth. He placed it on a tray in front of Ate. He unwrapped it. An object lay on the tray. Bronze, round, with teeth along the edge.
Perfectly even, perfectly identical. A gear. Ate stared at it and held his breath.
The teeth were machined to an involute profile. He knew that profile. He'd studied it in college. In his world, that profile was 400 years old. Here, it was 300. Ate reached out. He paused. He looked at Enmesh-Zar. The priest nodded. Ate picked up the gear. Heavy, covered in green patina. He turned it over in his hand, ran his finger along the teeth. Smooth, precise, not made by hand, made on a machine, or with a tool that doesn't exist in this world and never could. His finger found something on the side, an engraving, barely visible beneath the patina. 3 notches, a dot, 2 notches. Ate froze. 3, a dot, 2. Binary code, a letter. He withdrew his hand. Enmesh-Zar sat back down. He said, 300 years ago a man came here, just like you, from a distant land to which there is no return. He too built. He calculated. He taught. He made things we still do not understand. This gear is one of them. Ate asked, "What became of him?" Enmesh-Zar replied, "They burned him, my predecessors, right here." At the top of the temple, in front of the whole city. Ate was silent. Enmesh-Zar continued, "They burned him because they were afraid, because they didn't understand, because they thought that if they killed a man, knowledge would die with him." Ate said, "And knowledge did die." Enmesh-Zar nodded. "Along with him died what we don't know. Perhaps a great deal. Perhaps everything. All that remained was a gear and a fragment of a tablet with a diagram that no one can read." Ate returned from the capital and worked as if the ground were burning beneath his feet, because it was burning. He had 2 months left until the end of the year. 2 months until the Tsar demanded a miracle, and who knows how long until the Ashdura uprising. Maybe a month, maybe 3. Maybe the uprising would begin tomorrow. Ate couldn't control that. He could control only one thing: his Nom, his channels, his people. He decided to do something he hadn't planned. A school for scribes. Not a circle around a campfire. A real school, with a building, with a schedule, with teachers. The building was constructed in 10 days. Brick. 1 large room. 20 seats. A table made of clay slabs on stone legs. Narrow windows for light and ventilation. The floor was earthen,
but packed down and smooth. On the wall, Arte carved a chart, numbers from 1 to 100.
The decimal system, symbols for addition, subtraction, and multiplication. He looked at that wall and thought, here it is, the first blackboard in the first grade. In a world where knowledge belongs to priests, he had just opened the doors. Kibi and 2 of his best students became the teachers. A boy named Damik, 15 years old, quiet and focused. He could calculate in his head faster than Arte could write it down. And a girl named Lamu, 13 years old, the daughter of one of the women who had come during the Hungry Month. Small, with slender hands and a voice so clear that when she spoke the numbers they sounded like a song. Arte seated them at the teacher's desk and said, "Teach what you know. If you don't know, say you don't know. There's no shame in that. It's shameful to make up an answer." Kibi nodded. He understood. Damik nodded. Lamu nodded and blushed. Arte left. A week later, there were 30 students at the school. Not all of them were children. 5 were adults. 2 of them were women. One of them was Nanaya. Arte found out about this by chance. He came to the school in the evening to check the nameplates and saw Nanaya sitting at the back table, with a nameplate and a stylus. She was writing numbers, slowly, hesitantly, like a child. Arte stopped in the doorway. She looked up. She looked at him. There was something vulnerable in her eyes, something he'd never seen there before. Embarrassment. She said, "I've been counting with someone else's hands. Yours, Kibi. I want to do it with my own." Arte walked over. He sat down next to her. He looked at her slate. The 7 was written backwards. He pointed it out. Like this. She corrected it. He stood up. "I'll check it tomorrow," he said. She nodded. He walked out. He stopped outside the door. He leaned against the brick wall he'd built himself. The wall was warm from the midday sun. He stood there, thinking about how this woman had buried her daughter. She'd run his household. She had fed his village. And now, at 38, she had sat down at a desk to learn how to write the number 7. And he had no idea how to deal with it, with what he felt inside when he looked at her. The year was drawing to a close. Arte was preparing a report for the Tsar, on 20 tablets. Each village, each number. How many people there were, how many remained, how many died, how many were born. How much grain was harvested, how much was stored, how many bricks were fired, how many paces of the canal were dug, how many children were attending school, how many sick people were cured, how many died of disease. Every figure was verified, everyone was checked. He didn't embellish. The 4 who died in Mar Eshu were listed in the report just as clearly as the 19 survivors. Arte knew that honesty was the only weapon he had. If he lied even once, no one would ever believe him again. In the 12th month, Arte traveled to the capital, with Kibi, with Ki-aga, with 20 tablets, and with 5 sacks. The sacks contained various items: fired bricks, a pot made by Shala, a tablet with Ki-aga's notes, a small sack of grain from the new harvest, and a small model of a shadoof made of sticks and strings. Arte intended to show, not tell. The audience was scheduled for the morning. Arte stood in the same hall, the same columns, the same dim light. King Taharan on the throne. Nisaba stood slightly in the shadows. Enmeshsar was on the right. But there were more people in the hall. Nobles, military commanders, officials, about 30 people. Among them, Arte spotted a young official whom he had taught to count last time. The man stood by the wall and gave a barely noticeable nod. Arte did not nod back. Not here. Not in front of everyone. Arte laid out his bags in front of the throne. He opened them. He took out a brick. He placed it on the floor. He took out a pot. He set it down next to the brick.
He took out Kiagi's tablet. He placed it next to the pot. Grain, a model of a shadoof. He laid everything out in a row. Then he raised his head and began to speak. He spoke for half an hour, without a break, in the language he'd learned over the course of a year from sticking and sand and the patience of a boy with a cleft lip. He spoke about water, about canals, about bricks, about grain, about school, about learning, about death and life, about the 4 dead in Mar Eshu and the 100 living who would be dead without clean water. He wasn't exaggerating. He wasn't bragging. He laid out the figures before the king just as he had laid out the tablets before Nanaya. Here are the facts. Here are the numbers. See for yourself. The king listened. His expression didn't change. Arte couldn't read him. Young, tired, frightened by something Arte couldn't see. Perhaps a rebellion. Perhaps his own brothers. Perhaps simply the weight of a crown he hadn't asked for. When Arte finished, the king was silent. For a long time. The hall was silent. Then Taharan turned to Enmesh Saru.
The priest stood motionless.
His face, too, was expressionless, but he said nothing to object. He remained silent, and his silence was that very single gesture. The promised help, not to interfere. Arte calculated the war, not as a commander, as a logistician. 5,000 soldiers. Each needs 1.5 measures of grain per day, 1 measure of dried meat or fish every other day. Water, lots of water. 10 measures per person per day, accounting for the heat. That means 7,500 measures of grain per day, 2,500 measures of meat, 50,000 measures of water, every day, without interruption. If the campaign lasts 2 months, that's 450,000 measures of grain, 150,000 measures of meat, 3 million measures of water. Arte wrote the figures on tablets, and each new number felt like a stone on his shoulders. The kingdom of Urkash did not have that much grain in one place. It was scattered across hundreds of villages and dozens of nomes. It had to be gathered, transported, stored, distributed. Arte drew up a supply plan in 8 days, on 40 tablets. Caravan routes, collection points, warehouses, quantities for each warehouse, delivery order, reserves, alternative routes in case the main one was cut off. He used the principle he'd been taught at his university: first in, first out. The grain that had been stored the longest was distributed first. The freshest went on top. Nothing rotted, nothing went to waste. Simple logic. In a world where supplying the army meant taking everything the nearest village had and moving on, this was a revolution. He handed the tablets to the Tsar's military commander, an old stern man named Nergal Shah. Grey temples, a scar across his left cheek, hands like tree roots. He took the tablets, looked at them, then looked at Arte. He asked, "Have you fought in battle?" Arte replied, "No." Nergal Shah asked, "Then how do you know how much a soldier eats in a day?" Arte replied, "A soldier eats as much as a peasant who digs a canal from morning until noon." "I know how much a peasant eats. I kept track for a year." Nergal Shah was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You'll be with me at the supply train." Arte nodded. Ashdur's rebellion began 6 weeks later, just as Misaba had warned. The 3 northern gnomes declared that they would not recognize Taharan. Ashdur proclaimed himself the true heir.
3,000 warriors marched south toward the capital. Arte was at the Royal Army's camp, 2 days' journey north of the capital. He did not see the battle. He did not want to see it. He stood by the supply train and counted the sacks. His work was unremarkable and monotonous. Every day he checked the supplies,
He calculated consumption. He sent out caravans. He received new ones. He recorded. He verified. He corrected. Nergal-Shar came to him once a day and asked the same thing. How many days would the supplies last? Arte would answer, 22, 19, 15. The numbers kept dropping, every day. The caravans were late. The roads were bad. One caravan was robbed by steppe raiders. Arte sent messengers. He cursed. He recalculated the routes. He didn't sleep at night. He sat by the light of an oil lamp and wrote on slates. On the 9th day of the campaign, what Arte had feared happened. The grain ran at one of the forward warehouses. 300 soldiers were left without food. Nergal-Shar came to him, pale with rage. Arte made no excuses. He said, "The caravan was delayed at the crossing. It'll be here by evening. I have reserves to last until evening. Hardtack and dates. Enough for one day." Nergal-Shar asked, "Are you sure?" Arte replied, "Yes." The caravan arrived by evening. Arte exhaled. Nergal-Shar looked at him and, for the first time ever, nodded in a way that made Arte understand. Respect. A soldier's respect. Heavy and sparing, like a copper ingot. The rebellion was crushed not by the sword, but by hunger. Ashtur led his army through 100. He plundered villages. He ate their supplies. He moved on. But the villages he plundered were empty. Arte had calculated the direction of the attack in advance and sent messengers to the villages along Ashtur's army's route. Take the grain away. Take the livestock. Take the people. Hide whatever you can. Burn the rest. Don't leave a single sack for the enemy. The villages obeyed. Not all of them. Not right away. But those that did obey left behind empty granaries and dry wells. Ashtur's army marched across scorched earth, its own. Arte was not pleased. He knew what this meant for those villages. Starvation, ruin, months of recovery. But there was no other way. War is always a choice between bad and very bad. While the royal army ate 3 times a day, Ashtur's army starved. After 3 weeks, the first rebel units began to scatter. A month later, Ashtur retreated north.
6 weeks later, his own commanders bound him and brought him to Taharan. The rebellion was over. Without a great battle, without thousands of corpses on the battlefield. It ended because one army was well fed and the other was not. Nergal-Shar said to Arte, "You won this war not with a sword, but with a sack of grain." Arte replied, "Wars are not won. They are ended." Nergal-Shar looked at him. Then he turned away and left. Arte returned to Kaparsin. The village stood. The canals were flowing. The oven was smoking. The school was teaching. Kiaga was healing. Shala was making pottery. Nanaya was keeping the records. Everything was running smoothly. Without him. He stood at the edge of the village, looking at it all and thinking. So that's it. That's why. Not to be irreplaceable, but to become unnecessary. So that the system would run on its own, without his hands, without his voice. Without his voice. It just worked. After the Ashtur rebellion, the world had changed. Not the whole world. The world of Arte. King Taharan summoned him to the capital and announced before the entire court, "This man saved my army. This man saved my throne. From now on, he bears the title of Royal Builder and has the right to enter the palace without an invitation." Arte stood and listened. The title was an empty phrase. The right to enter the palace was a golden key. It meant access. To the king, to the treasury, to decisions, to Nisab. He pushed that last thought away immediately.
Don't think about it. Not now. He returned to Kapar Sin and spent a week in silence. He walked along the canals. He inspected the brickwork. He sat in the school and listened as Kibby taught the children. Kibby had grown up. He was 13. The split lip had healed, leaving a white scar that made his face look older. His voice was breaking. His arms had grown longer. He spoke to the students calmly and patiently, just as Arte had spoken to him 2 years ago. Arte sat in a corner and watched. The boy was teaching a girl of about 10 how to determine the slope of water in a trough. The girl got confused. Kibby didn't get annoyed. He repeated it. Again and again. Arte watched and thought, this is it. This is what it's all about. Not the canal, not the bricks. This moment, when a student becomes a teacher, when knowledge ceases to belong to a single person and begins to live on its own. But the world wouldn't give him any peace.
In the second week after his return, a letter arrived from Nisaba. Not a tablet with a problem, a letter. A long one, on 3 tablets. She wrote that Taharan was sick, nothing serious, a fever, but he's weak after the uprising and he's not sleeping well or eating well, and people are circling him, sensing his weakness just as jackals sense a wounded gazelle. She wrote that Enmesh Zar is silent. He's not helping. He's not getting in the way, but he's silent. And his silence is more unsettling than words. She wrote that Princess Tashmitam is asking for a foreigner who counts water to be brought. She had been afflicted by black water and survived, and ever since has believed that Arte can cure anything. A child's faith, dangerous and touching at the same time. Arte went to the capital. He took Kiaga. She didn't want to go. She was afraid of the palace, afraid of the priests, afraid of the capital with its smells and crowds and walls that pressed down on her like a giant's palms. Arte told her, "You're the best doctor in the world. I'm not exaggerating. You're the only person who records symptoms and compares treatments. I need you." Kiaga was silent. Then she said quietly, "I'm not the best doctor. I just take notes." Arte replied, "That's exactly what makes you the best doctor." She set off. Taharan lay in his chambers, pale, thin, with dark circles under his eyes even deeper than last time. Kiaga examined him, silently. She placed her hand on his forehead, on his stomach, on his neck just below his jaw. Then she went out to Arte and said, "The fever is mild. His stomach is soft. His pulse is rapid but steady. It's not black water. It's exhaustion. Poor food, poor sleep, a lot of fear." Arte asked, "What should we do?" Kiaga listed the remedies. Mint tea to help him sleep, willow bark for the fever, boiled fish and fresh bread instead of fatty meat and wine, walks in the fresh air, silence, and that no one should stand over him casting spells because that keeps him from sleeping. Arte relayed this to Nisaba. Nisaba nodded and did everything. A week later, Taharan got out of bed. 2 weeks later, he began to leave his chambers. 3 weeks later, he was back at work. Kiaga sat in the palace all 3 weeks and kept records. Morning temperature, evening temperature, what he ate, how much he slept, when he felt better, when he felt worse. The first medical record of a king in the history of Urkash. While Taharan was recovering, Arte met Tashmitam. The princess found him on her own. She came to the guest wing, without warning, without maids. She was 17 years old, petite. Lively, with quick eyes and hands that never rested. She was always touching something. The wall, the edge of the table, her braid. She said, "You're the one who saved my life." Arte replied, "I'm the one who fed you with a spoon." She smiled. Then she said,
I want to learn from you.
Artie looked at her. She wasn't joking. He asked, "What?" She said, "Everything." Artie paused. Then he said, "Let's start small. Count how many grains of grain are in the palace's third granary." She frowned. "That's boring," she said. Artie replied, "That's the foundation. Without it, nothing else works." She sulked for 3 days. On the 4th day, she went to the granary. She counted. She brought him a tally slip. Artie checked it. There was a mistake in the addition. He pointed it out. She looked at the mistake. Her face flushed. She snatched the tally slip from him and left. An hour later, she returned with the correct answer. Artie nodded. He said, "Good. Now the 4th granary." She looked at him with an expression that was both angry and grateful. She went off to count. A month later, Tashmitam was keeping track of 3 palace granaries. Quickly, accurately, with handwriting that was twice as neat as Kibby's. She came to Artie every evening with the slates and reported. This many sacks, this much used per day, this much left. It'll last for this many days. Artie checked and nodded. She left, satisfied, with her head held high. Artie thought, a princess, 17 years old, counting sacks in a granary, and happy, because for the first time in her life she's doing something real, not dancing at banquets, not trying on jewelry, counting sacks. And that's more important than all the jewelry in the world. Ayana appeared quietly, the way people who are used to being inconspicuous appear. Artie didn't immediately realize who she was. A tall, thin woman with a long braid and empty eyes. She was standing by the wall in the palace courtyard looking at him, silently. Artie walked past her. Then he stopped. He turned back. He asked, "Who are you?" She replied, "Ayana from the steppe. A hostage. 10 years." Artie was silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Do you want to go home?" She was silent for so long that he thought she hadn't heard him. Then she said, "I don't know where my home is." Artie nodded. He said, "Then maybe you can help me build one." She looked at him. For the first time during their entire conversation, her eyes came alive. Not a smile, not joy, a spark, small and dim, but alive. She asked, "What do you want from me?" Artie replied, "You know the steppe people, their language, their customs, their trails. I need someone who understands them. Not for war, for dialogue." Ayana was silent. Then she nodded. Once. Briefly. Like sealing a contract. The 2nd year of the nomads' rule was the year Arte stopped building and began governing. The difference was enormous. To build is to work with your own hands. To govern is to have others do the work. And trusting that those hands will do it right. Arte hated that. He was an engineer. He wanted to stand knee-deep in clay and check the slope with a string. Instead, he sat in Kapar Sin and read tablets. Dozens of tablets every day. Reports from the elders, scribes' records, invoices from caravans, complaints, requests, accusations. He was drowning in paperwork, in clay tablets, an irony only he himself would appreciate. Nanaya saved him. Every evening she would sit down next to him and sort through the tablets. She sorted them. Urgent ones here, important ones here, the ones that could wait here, trash in the corner. She had learned to read over the past few months. Not quickly, not everything, but enough to tell a grain report from a complaint about a neighbor. Arte watched her as she bent over the tablets in the light of the oil lamp. Shadows fell across her face. Sharp cheekbones, wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, dark hands with calloused fingers. She was beautiful. Not the kind of beauty painted on temple walls, the kind of beauty that comes from fatigue and hard work and a quiet stubbornness to keep going when everything tells you to stop. One evening, Arte placed his hand on hers, which was resting on a tablet. She didn't pull away. She didn't look up. She simply turned her palm upward and squeezed his fingers. They sat like that for a minute, in silence. Then she said, "You have ink on your cheek." He said, "It's clay." She said, "Whatever. Wipe it off." He wiped it off. She smiled. For the first time in 2 years, he saw her smile genuinely. Not bitterly, not dryly, warmly. Shallow found out. Of course she did. It's a small village. Everyone sees everything. She came to Arte that morning. She stood in front of him, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes burning. She said, "You've made your choice." Arte replied, "I didn't choose anyone." She said, "Don't lie to me. You chose her." Arte was silent for a moment.
Then he said honestly, "I don't know what I chose. I know she's by my side, that I feel at peace with her, that she doesn't demand anything from me except that I wipe the clay off my face."
Shala looked at him for a second, 2, 3. Then her expression changed. The anger was gone. Something else remained. Pain. But not the kind of pain that screams, the kind that's silent. She said quietly, "I won't wait. But I won't leave. This is my studio, my students, my work. You gave this to me. I won't give it up." Arte nodded. She turned and walked away. Her back was straight. Her stride was steady. Arte stood there thinking that this girl was 10 times stronger than he was, and that he would never tell her that because she already knew it. But Shala didn't go far. A month later, she came to him again, not to talk, to present a project. She'd come up with a new glaze for pottery, a mixture of river sand and the ash of a specific tree that, when fired, produced a smooth, shiny finish, almost like glass. Arte looked at the pot coated with this glaze. Smooth, shiny, watertight. He turned it over in his hands and said, "You know what this means?" she asked. "What?" he said. "Waterproof pottery. Storing liquids, oil, wine, honey, medicinal decoctions. Everything that's currently spoiling in porous pots." She nodded. She knew. She'd already calculated how many of these pots she could make in a month. Arte looked at her and said, "You're the great master, Shala." She blushed. She mumbled something indistinct. She left. But he saw it. The corner of her mouth twitched upward, for half a second. That was enough. The epidemic reached the capital in the 6th month of the 2nd year. Black water, the real thing, not like in Mareshu, on a much larger scale. A city of 20,000 inhabitants with no sewage system, no clean water, and no understanding of hygiene. The perfect environment for cholera. People began to die on the 3rd day, 10 a day, then 20. Then they stopped counting. The priests slaughtered lambs on the altar of Shamar. Blood flowed down the steps of the Ikurat. Smoke from the sacrificial fires rose into the sky. Nothing helped. The messenger arrived in Kapar Sin at night. Arte got ready in an hour. He took Kiagu. He took 5 disciples. He took a supply of dried herbs, salt, honey, clean cloth. He set off. This time he didn't walk. He rode a donkey, quickly. 2 days' journey instead of 4. The capital greeted him with the smell of death.
Thick and sweet. Bodies lay against the walls of the houses. They hadn't had time to remove them. The flies buzzed so loudly they drowned out people's voices. Arte walked through the streets and counted. Not the dead, the sources of infection. The canal running through the market. Sewage from 50 houses further up the street flowed into it. A well by the temple, open, without walls. 3 steps away from it, a garbage pit. A water carrier drawing water from the city canal and selling it on the corner. Murky, green, for a copper coin. Arte saw the whole system, the entire web of death. A web of dirty water, ignorance, and a 1,000-year-old habit. He went to the king. Taharan was pale. His sister, Tashmitum, lay in her chambers with a fever and vomiting. Nisaba stood next to the king, her face like a mask, white and motionless. Arte said, "I need authority over the city for 1 week. Complete authority, no questions asked." Taharan looked at him, then at Nisaba. She nodded. The king said, "Take it." Arte sprang into action. 7 days, without sleep. He divided the city into 4 parts. He sent 1 apprentice to each, accompanied by a group of soldiers. The orders were simple. First, block off all the city's canals. No one drinks raw water, only boiled water. Soldiers stand guard at every well and canal and won't let anyone through. Second, gather all the sick in one place, the eastern courtyard of the temple. There are no large tents. Set up reed shelters. Separate the sick from the healthy. Third, bury all waste outside the city walls, deeply, not in pits near the houses, outside the walls. Fourth, bury the dead outside the city, not in the city graves, outside the city, deeply, with lime if available. The city resisted. People didn't want to boil water. They didn't want to leave their wells. They didn't want to hand over the sick. They didn't want to change their habits. Soldiers stood by the canals and wouldn't let them through. Women screamed. Old men cursed. Arte stood in the midst of this chaos and did not back down. Not because he was cruel, because every hour of delay meant 1 more dead child. Kiaga worked in the eastern courtyard, with 3 assistants she had trained over the past year. They gave the sick patients saline solution, 1 sip at a time, every 5 minutes. Hundreds of people, hundreds of sips, hundreds of entries on the charts. Kiaga hadn't slept for 3 days. Arte made her lie down on the 4th day. She lay down. 2 hours later, she got up. She told him she couldn't sleep. Arte said, "Then eat." She ate. She returned to the patients. Tashmitum, the princess, a 17-year-old girl with a fever and sunken eyes. Arte came to her at night, with a box, oiled water, salt, honey, a clean cloth. He sat down next to her and began to feed her with a spoon. 1 sip every 5 minutes, just as he had done with that child from Nar Ilu 2 years ago. Only that child was a stranger, while this girl counted the sacks in the granary and called him teacher, and looked at him with eyes full of stubborn delight. Arte fed her. He counted the minutes. He counted the sips. Nisaba stood in the doorway, silently. She didn't leave. The priests were shouting from behind the wall, demanding to be let in, to perform the ritual, to slaughter the lamb, to fill the chambers with the smoke of sacred herbs. Taharan stood in the hallway and said nothing. He wouldn't let them in, not because he didn't believe the priests, because he believed in Arte. After the epidemic, Arte ceased to be a stranger. Not formally. Formally, he remained one. But in the eyes of the people, he had become something else. A man who came when things were frightening and made them safe. That changed everything. Before, people listened to him because they were afraid or because he was useful. Now they listened to him because they believed in him. The difference was enormous. A useful person is used as long as he's useful. A person who is trusted is given time.
And time was the one resource Arte had always lacked. The Tsar gave him more than just a second nom. He gave him a mandate. Build whatever you want, wherever you want. Show me the results in a year. Arte didn't ask what would happen if he didn't deliver. He knew. But this time he wasn't afraid. Because this time he wasn't alone. He had people. Trained. Tested. Ready. Nom turned into a construction site. Arte launched 4 projects simultaneously. The first, a water supply for the capital. Not a full-fledged water system, that would have been impossible in a year, but a separate line of clean water from a spring outside the city. 2 kilometers of clay pipes. Each pipe was made in Shala's workshop. Fired clay covered with the very glaze she had invented. Watertight, smooth. The water flowed through the pipes without touching the ground, without mixing with the dirt. Pure, clear from start to finish. Arte designed it. Shala made the pipes.
Pabil made the bronze fittings. 200 people dug the trench. 4 months of work. The second project, a brick factory. Not just a kiln, but a factory. 3 large continuous firing kilns. Each produced 200 bricks per firing. 2 firings a week. 1,200 bricks a week. 5,000 a month. That was enough to build. Granaries, walls, houses, schools. Arte set up the factory in Mar Eshu. Pabil managed it. He had returned from Dur Shag, because Dur Shag already had its own kiln master, a trained one, independent. He didn't need Pabil. The system worked. The third project, a school for scribes in the capital. Not secret, open, with the king's permission, 20 students, all from families of officials and merchants, not peasants, not children, adult men who already knew how to read the priestly symbols. Arte taught them the decimal system. He taught them to count. He taught them to write. He taught them to compare. After to write. He taught them to compare. After 3 months, 15 out of 20 could calculate faster than the priestly scribes. This was predictable. The decimal system is simpler, faster, more efficient. Just as a fired brick is stronger than an unfired one, it simply works better. The guardians of the word saw this, and they remained silent, because Enmesh-Zar was silent, and Enmesh-Zar was silent because he had promised once, and he kept his word. The fourth project, Arte sent Ayana to the steppe people, not to fight, to talk. She rode alone, on a horse the king had given her, carrying tablets from Arte. The tablets bore a proposal: trade, grain, pottery, and bricks in exchange for livestock, wool, and hides. A fair exchange, based on value. The steppe people weren't used to value. They were used to strength. Whoever is stronger takes what they want. Ayana knew this. She was one of them. She spoke their language. She knew how to talk to them, not from a position of strength, from a position of mutual benefit. You have livestock. Your livestock dies of hunger in the winter. We'll provide grain. Your livestock will survive. You'll give us wool. We'll clothe our people. Everyone stays alive. Everyone is fed. No one goes to war. The steppe chieftains listened. They thought it over. One agreed, then a second, then a third. Ayana returned 2 months later with a caravan of 20 pack horses loaded with wool and hides, and with a smile. Arte had never seen her smile before. It was like watching a stone bloom. In the 3rd year, Arte ceased to be a builder. He became something for which there was no word in this world. Not a king, not a priest, not a chieftain, something else.
A man to whom people came with questions. Everyone. Peasants came to ask when to plant. Merchants came to ask how to calculate profits. The military commander Nergal Shah came to ask how much grain to buy for the winter campaign. Even the priests came. Not Enmesh-Zar. Young priests, in secret, at night. They asked how to predict the river's flooding. Arte took out his tablets. 40 years of observations he had gathered from the priestly archives and translated into his own system. Here are the water levels by month. Here is the pattern. A major flood once every 7 years. Once every 3 years, a minor one. In between, a moderate one. It's not the gods who decide. The rains in the mountains decide. The young priests listened. They left. They thought. They came back again. Enmesh-Zar knew about these visits. Of course he knew. He knew everything that was happening in his temple. But he remained silent. Arte sometimes wondered why. Then he stopped wondering. Because he understood. Enmesh-Zar wasn't silent. He was letting them go. Slowly. One by one. He allowed the young priests to come to Arte. He allowed them to learn. He allowed them to doubt. The old man was preparing the transition. Not a quick one. Not a loud one. A quiet one. Like water seeping through stone, so that after 100 years no stone remains. Tashmetum had grown up. She was 18. She kept track of half the palace. She knew how much grain was in every granary, how much oil, how much wine, how much cloth. She could calculate faster than any scribe. Arte once put her to the test. He gave her a problem he'd given his students in Novosibirsk. To calculate the grain consumption for 3,000 people over 6 months, taking seasonal fluctuations into account. She solved it in 2 hours. Correct. Arte looked at her name tag and realized she was no longer a student. She was a colleague. He told her so. She looked at him. Her eyes sparkled. Then she said, "That means I can argue with you." He replied, "That means you have to argue with me. If I'm wrong, you have to tell me." She smiled, broadly, for the first time without a trace of resentment or defiance. Just joy, pure and bright. Kiaga set up a clinic, a small one. 2 rooms made of fired brick, one for examinations, the other for seriously ill patients. 5 beds, clean linens, a supply of herbs.
Boiled water, always available. She trained 4 assistants. Each knew the symptoms of common illnesses. Each knew how to prepare a saline solution and a willow bark decoction. Each kept records. Kiaga checked every entry every evening. Arte came to her once with a board on which he had drawn a simple diagram. The human body, organs, their locations, roughly, approximate, from memory based on his school textbooks. She stared at the diagram for half an hour. She didn't move. Then she looked up. Her eyes were filled with tears. She said, "I felt this with my hands, my whole life, but I didn't see it. Now I see it." Arte said, "This isn't an exact diagram. I'm drawing from memory. I might be wrong." She nodded. She said, "I'll check it, by feeling the patients, by what I feel with my hands, and I'll write it down." Arte nodded, and he thought that in 100 years someone would find her notes and see the first anatomical atlas of this world, drawn by a woman who hadn't known how to read just 3 years ago. The water supply for the capital began operating in the 4th month of the 3rd year. 2 kilometers of clay pipes, clean water from a mountain spring. It flowed into a stone basin near the central square. People came and scooped it up. They drank. Clean, cold, clear, odorless. An old man stood by the basin and drank. For a long time. Then he set his mug on the edge. He stood there, staring at the water. Arte was walking by. He stopped. The old man turned to him and said, "I've been drinking from the ditch for 60 years. I didn't know water could be like this." Arte said nothing. The old man continued, "My children drank from the ditch. My grandchildren drank from the ditch. 2 of them died. Now I know why." Arte said nothing. The old man bowed to him, low. Arte lifted him by the shoulders.
He said, "Don't bow to me. Drink the water. Live. That's enough." Ashtura was put on trial. Taharan did not execute him. He sent him into exile to a distant nom in the south, under supervision. Arte wasn't interested in politics, but politics was interested in him. The nobles who had looked at him with contempt a year ago now bowed when they met him. Not because they had come to love him, because they understood. Without this man, the water doesn't flow. The bread doesn't grow. Taxes wouldn't be collected. He had become indispensable. That was his protection, and his prison. Because a man who is indispensable cannot leave, cannot stop.
Cannot say, "Enough, I'm tired." Sometimes at night, Arte would lie next to Nanaya and think, "Someday I'll no longer be needed, and that will be the best day of my life." It was as if she could hear his thoughts. She spoke in the darkness. "Sleep. Tomorrow is tomorrow." He fell asleep. The Great Assembly was Nisaba's idea, not Arte's, Nisaba's. She had come to him with this idea during one of their rare private conversations. She said, 12 gnomes, they must all be bound together by a single treaty. One system of measurement, one law regarding water. Arte listened. She continued, "You built canals, you built schools, but you didn't build what matters most. You didn't build harmony. Every nom obeys you because you're here. When you're gone, they'll scatter. We need a document, a written treaty, one that every chief will sign with his own hand and be able to read." Arte looked at her. She stood before him in a white dress, calm, confident. She spoke of the structure of government. She counted political forces the way he counted sacks of grain. He said, "You could be a king." She replied, "I'm already a queen. That's enough." She paused. Then she added quietly, "But thank you." Arte worked on the treaty for 3 months, with Nisaba, with Tashmitum, with Kibi, who was now the nom's chief scribe, with Nergal Shah, who knew military matters, with Ayana, who knew the steppe people. The treaty turned out to be long, 24 tablets, the rights and obligations of each nom, the law on water. No one may block a canal running through another nom's territory. The law on grain, a common reserve in case of famine. The law on schools, a school in every nom. The law on counting, a unified system, decimal. The law of the courts. Disputes are resolved not by weapons, but by evidence and numbers. How much grain was stolen? That much must be returned. Arte wrote these laws and thought he was drafting a constitution for a state that predated the first constitution by 3,000 years. And perhaps that was his greatest achievement. Not the canals, not the bricks. Words on clay that will outlive him. The morning of the Great Assembly began with fog. Thick white fog rose from the Naat River and spread along the banks. The sun had not yet risen. Arte stood on the stone pier, the first stone pier in the history of Ur-Karsh. He had built it over the past month, using fired bricks and stone brought from the north. It jutted 10 paces into the river, level, smooth.
Sturdy. He stood on it, gazing at the fog and listening to the water lapping against the stone. Behind him, people were gathering. Many people, more than he had expected. 12 nom chieftains, each with 10 attendants. King Taharan IV with his guard. Nisaba in a white gown with a golden net over her hair. Tashmitum beside her, alive, well, holding tablets in her hands, always with her tablets. Nergal Shah in a bronze breastplate, young priests in dark robes, officials, scribes, merchants, soldiers, peasants from nearby villages who had come to watch. Children who would come because children always come. Arte turned and looked at those standing closest to him. His people. Nanaya, calm, holding a tally tablet in her hands, as always. She caught his gaze and nodded slightly. A single movement, brief, meaning everything. I'm here. You're not alone. Shala. She stood slightly to the side, arms crossed over her chest, chin raised, eyes narrowed. She looked at the chiefs with the expression of a master assessing someone else's work and finding it lacking. Around her neck hung a necklace of glazed beads she'd made herself. Blue and green, they glistened in the dawn light. Kiaga, quiet, with large eyes, with a small pouch of dried herbs on her belt. She never parted with it, just as a soldier never parts with his sword. Pabil, silent, broad-shouldered, with hands bearing old burns from the furnace. He stood and looked at the pier he had helped build, and there was something like pride on his face. Quiet, masculine, unspoken. Ayana, tall, upright, with hair down to her waist. She stood behind Arte's right shoulder, slightly behind him, the way a person stands when guarding someone. Not by order, by choice. Kibi, a 13-year-old boy who had become a young man, with a scar on his lip and a stack of tablets under his arm. The Nom's chief scribe, 14 in 2 months, and already a teacher. The fog began to lift. The sun broke through the white veil, golden, warm, honey-coloured. The very same sun that 2.5 years ago had burned his eyes as he lay face down in the sand, not knowing where he was. Arte looked at it and thought, It was the same sun, the same river, the same dust. But the world was different. He had made it different. Not alone, together with them. The ceremony was simple. Arte didn't like pomp. Taharan agreed. Each chieftain took turns approaching the stone table that Arte had set up on the pier.
On the table lay 12 blank tablets, wet clay, soft, ready to receive the marks. Each chieftain took a stylus, wrote his name and the words of the oath. Short, simple. I, the chieftain of such and such a Nom, pledge to follow the law of water, the law of grain, the law of schools, the law of counting. 12 lines, 12 signatures. Each was written by the hand of a man who, 3 years ago, could not write his own name. Now he could. Arte taught him. His students taught them. His students' students taught them. The first chief, old, lame, with a white beard. He approached the table, took a stylus. His hand trembled. He wrote, slowly, crookedly, but he wrote. He put down the stylus. He looked at Arte. He nodded. The second chief, young, nervous. He wrote quickly, almost carelessly, but correctly. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Each one stepped forward. Each one wrote. Each one placed their tablet with the rest. The stack grew. Arte stood and watched. He counted, out of habit. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 tablets lay on the stone table. 12 oaths, written by 12 people, with their own hands, in a language they themselves could read. For the first time in the history of Ur-Kash, power was sealed not by a priest's seal, but by a word written by the hand of the one who swore the oath. Not through an intermediary, not through an interpreter. Directly. A person, a sign, clay, a promise. Arte looked at the tablets and didn't immediately realize what was happening to his face.
Then he understood. He was crying, quietly, silently. Tears streamed down his sun-scorched cheeks and fell onto the stone of the pier. He was crying the way engineers cry. Not out of grief, not out of joy. Because it works. Because the project you sketched in the sand with a stick, in the mud with your hands, and in the darkness by the light of an oil lamp finally stands before you. Alive, real, working. Nanaya approached from behind, quietly. She placed her hand on his shoulder. He could feel her palm through the fabric. Warm, heavy. She leaned toward his ear and said, so that no one else could hear, "You've built a house. Now it's time to live in it." Arte nodded. He couldn't speak. His throat tightened. She squeezed his shoulder. Then she withdrew her hand. She stood beside him, silently, just as she always stood, beside him. The sun rose over the river. The fog lifted. The morning turned golden. Taharan gave a short speech. Arte wasn't listening.
He was looking at his people, at Kibi, who was writing down every word, at Shalu, who was looking at the pier with a professional squint, assessing the masonry, at Kiagu, who stood at the edge of the crowd and discreetly checked the pulse of the elderly chieftain who had become unwell from the heat, at Pabil, who silently adjusted a stone that had shifted on the pier's steps, at Ayana, who was looking out at the steppe beyond the river and, for the first time, didn't look lost, at Tashmetum, who was counting the signs and moving her lips to check the numbers, at Nisab, who stood next to her husband and looked straight ahead. Calm, beautiful, intelligent, distant and close at the same time. That evening, after the chieftains had left, the crowd had dispersed, and the pier had emptied, Arte was left alone. He sat on the edge, dangling his legs over the water. The Naht River flowed below, dark in the twilight, silent. He sat there, listening to the water, thinking. 2.5 years ago, he woke up in the sand, without a language, without friends, without tools, with a head full of knowledge that no one here needed. Now 12 gnomes had signed the treaty. Thousands of people were drinking clean water. Hundreds of children knew how to count. Dozens of craftsmen were making bricks, pottery, and pipes. Canals carried water to the fields. Granaries stored grain. The infirmary treated the sick. The school taught scribes. And all of this was working without him. Right now, while he sat on the pier dangling his feet over the water, the canals flowed. The furnaces burned. Children were counting. Without his hands, without his voice, without him. He remembered the bronze gear, that predecessor, 300 years ago. He too built. He too taught. He too wanted to change the world. They burned him. And all that remained was a single gear in the temple's basement. Arte thought, more will remain of me. Not a gear, not a single thing. A system. People who know. Children who teach other children. Tablets that can be read. Laws that have been written down. These cannot be burned. They cannot be destroyed. They cannot be forgotten. Because they aren't in just one mind. They're in thousands of minds. Irreversible, as he told Enmesh Zaru. Not fast. Irreversible. He thought about the engraving on the gear. 3 notches. A dot. 2 notches. Binary code. Someone left a message 300 years ago for whoever could read it. Arte didn't know what it meant. Maybe an initial. Maybe a symbol. Maybe just a greeting. From one solitude to another,
across the centuries. He thought, I'll leave a message too, not on bronze, on clay, on stone, on the school walls, on the students' nameplates, on the canals that will carry water when his bones turn to dust. Here is his message. Look, someone here knew what they were doing. Footsteps behind him. He didn't turn around. He knew who it was. Nanaya sat down beside him. She dangled her legs next to his, her small, tanned feet next to his large ones. They sat in silence. The river flowed. The sun was setting below the horizon. The sky turned orange, then pink, then dark blue. The first stars lit up above the river. Nanaya said, "What are you thinking about?" Artie replied, "About water." She snorted. "Be quiet," she said. "You're always thinking about water," he replied. "Not always. Sometimes I think about you." She was silent. Then she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat like that for a long time, until the stars filled the entire sky. Somewhere far away, in the basement of the Temple of Shammar, old Enmesh-Zar sat by the light of an oil lamp. A bronze gear lay on the stone table in front of him. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He ran his finger along the teeth. Perfectly smooth, perfectly precise. 300 years old. He recalled Artie's words. Not quickly, irreversibly. The old man looked at the gear, then at the shelf with the tablets. Among the old priestly records stood new ones, with numbers, in the decimal system, with the names of students who were already teaching others. Enmesh-Zar placed the gear back on the table. He looked at it. And for the first time in 40 years, he smiled. Not bitterly, not wearily, calmly, like a man who has finally seen what he's been waiting for his whole life. Not the end of the old world, the beginning of a new one. The moon was rising over the Naat River. Canals carried water to the fields. Furnaces smoldered with a quiet heat. At the school, carved numbers glistened on the wall in the lamplight, from 1 to 100. Artie sat on the stone pier next to the woman who had taught him that a home is not walls or a roof. A home is a person who waits. The river flowed. The world was warm and quiet and smelled of clay, smoke, and water. And everything Artie had built stood firm, solid, even, just as good masonry should stand, brick by brick, joint by joint, for centuries to come.